Okay, this is another episode of Narrative Wake. You notice I didn't say the episode number there. That's because we being myself and Kelsey Moser, co-host, are rolling out our revolutionary new format for the off-season, which no one expected, no one knew, which was similar to, we actually did an episode of this already where we did the one that was about the career of Ryu. And so not all the episodes are going to have veteran in. I'll just go ahead and say that right now, because I can already see what you're thinking. I already know what you're thinking. First of all, you know, he's been very kind and helped stand in for an episode. We didn't just invite him like 7 times or something, you know. He helped stand in for an episode, so blame people, like especially people in Korea who hate Western shit, who just don't turn up to episodes, because, you know, that's not my fault. I don't make them do that. I don't make them be old mad divas and just magically get new types of illness that didn't exist 10 minutes ago. They're probably literally sitting wearing one of those fucking masks that the women wear, like, oh, help, the Western illness, you know. I hope that I didn't make that too specific. I tried to keep it nice and vague, you know. So anyway, for this episode, there's a good reason why we've got veteran on. It's not just because LS isn't available. This one's actually because we've got a topic to discuss, and this is the point of the new premise, is that during the off-season, obviously shows that do just like weekly stuff, they have to go away. There's not enough to talk about. You can't just talk about roster moves. But I thought what we would do was we would make it, since it's a discussion show anyway, and actually when you do 3-hour discussion shows, one of the best features is you get down these little tangents where, I mean, funnily enough, it's exactly what, believe it or not, Kelsey, everyone, when I was at my old website that I used to work for, who actually had production history, used to tell me not to do. They used to tell me, you make the show an hour long, it never goes over the hour, because, you know, they have that retarded logic of like, you want people coming back for more, you want them to, oh, I wish there was more of this episode. Like, they use that logic, right? They used that, and then they said also you should always plan out the discussion, you know, and you should keep them on track so that, you know, stay where you want to go. But the whole point is, I actually learned myself from doing shows. That's actually the exact opposite what you want to do, because you can't reverse engineer an amazing conversation. The whole point is you have to start the conversation and see where it heads, and then hopefully steer away from the parts that are rubbish. I haven't always been as good as that. Sometimes I just go through the parts that are rubbish. I go, right, well, is this a train wreck? Let's see how far we can go with this. And at other times, if I do a good job, we steer towards a good conversation. And ideally, if you start, you just keep going down there. So these are just going to be like that, but in an episode. So the topic for this show, co-host Kelsey Moser, as you obviously noticed, she hasn't joined the Mormons or anything. Don't worry. That's just you know, just today's wardrobe choice. I don't know why, you know.
It's what happens when you go to the Midwest, you know.
Oh, right. She's gone back to her roots. Okay, I see. Not even any makeup. I mean, what's bizarre is, I've actually met you in real life. I'm not sure if you're wearing makeup. But every time I see you on these episodes, you got your cheeks sucked in like a model. You're looking a bit more god. You know, I don't know. Is this and the kids gotten so advanced with filters that that's what's going on right now. I don't know what. Is this really your camera? Is this who you are?
Yeah. Actually, I am wearing some makeup, but... Okay. I mean, you never can tell. That's why I'm doing it right? Okay. This is what people tell me. I honestly don't have any idea what I'm doing, so it's great.
No, well, that's the thing. You are correct, by the way. Absolutely. And most men I know would agree with this if they've ever like had any experience in life, that if a woman does her makeup properly, the idea is you can't really tell. You know, the quality just look very good, etc. I mean, maybe I'm just giving away too much about myself, but I kind of like women who just, they expressly have too much makeup on, you know, go a bit trashy, you know, because, you know, that's just, so again, it's all about the signals we're sending, you know. And again, no judgment on my part. No judgment on my part. Just appreciation, and probably don't have to try as hard. But speaking of not having to try as hard, our guest for this episode is veteran. And you don't have to try on this show, you see, because what you have to understand about veteran that we've known for a long time is that he's someone who's very opinionated. He's someone who thinks he's right in a lot of instances. He even thinks he's right in instances where you could almost objectively say it's impossible to know if anyone is right, because it's like purely subjective, you know. But he still thinks he definitely is right, and will present it as if it was an objective fact and opinion. And here's the thing about that, right? That actually can work quite well on a talk show, because first of all, the other person can give a different perspective, so you can frame it against that, you know. The problem is when you just rant like that on your own, it can actually be perceived as obnoxious, believe it or not, you know. You know, veteran? I mean, I know, but I come and ask someone who is obnoxious. Like, I actually had to learn to sort of sell that as sort of a charming, like, oh, I'm just a WWE heel. This is all an act. I just know how to get exposure. I don't really. What I've done is it's the opposite. You know, I am an asshole.
I've never claimed to be an act. I've never claimed.
No, you haven't. That's the point I'm making here, veteran. If anything, you missed the point. There is that we're actually just assholes, but you have to learn how to pretend like it's an act, and therefore people will accept it. Be like, oh, it's okay, as long as it's just for fun and the cameras, you know. But no, this is real. So let's start then. The topic for this one, quite broadly to begin with, and we'll see where we go with it. Is we had this little tangent on one of the episodes you were on about how Western teams build their squads. And now whether that be how you recruit a player or how you set up the infrastructure of your teams, I remember two of the things that we were talking about was, in terms of the infrastructure, it was the idea of like do you have a whole coaching staff? Do you get a Korean coach? There's a lot of different ways you can go with that one. Obviously, again, the problem, which is usually how you frame the discussion, is, you know, what things do they do well in Korea? And then I always think you have to add the second part, which no one does, which is what do they do in Korea just because they're Koreans? You know, that's like, the second part's pretty key, believe it or not. You need to look at the Koreans, because obviously there's going to be some things they do correctly. But as you can see by what's going on with Kesper right now, not everything they do necessarily bang on point or how you'd want to do things. Then the other aspect is, if we want to talk about the player approach, is, I mean, I know one thing I'm very passionate about that no one else seems to care about, is I think that players are really terribly recruited just from the position of like, would this player fit the team that we have? Like I've seen, I feel as though to this day, teams still recruit players like first of all, they look at him in isolation, like he is a good player, he would be good. And then secondly, they're like, he's a good player and we can get him. And I don't know that they ever get further than that, because at that point they either get him or they don't get him. And it feels like some of the teams we've had, which were, you know, big, high investment teams. A famous one comes to mind with the NRG squad of season 5, I think it was. Yeah. These teams just look like someone assembled good. It was like someone made an esports pool fantasy team, as it were. They just tried to get the good players that they could and thought, right, well, this will work. And obviously, you know, some of those players actually had no like kind of stylistic synergy, you know, it would have had to relearn the game almost. So why don't we start on the player angle? Because I feel like the player one's the one that people are most suited to understand, being as it's the off season, being as, you know, even the most basic fan discussion tends to be like, you know, if this player isn't playing well, should we replace him with player X, or, you know, what type of player should we get in the off season? So let's start there then, veteran. I have to say, in League of Legends, I realize there's a lot of extenuating factors. It's a game where you can't actually know what the meta will be 3 months from now. So if you recruit someone, even if he was perfect for the next split, maybe he's terrible for the next split. Then you got to add in the other factor that these players can't actually have played together. Like, there's no test period in League of Legends, right? When you sign a player, sure, you can bench him, but first of all, there's not an advanced bench system, you know? If you bench someone, that's probably a bad for your org, you know? If you bench some star AD carry and you have to use the person who was willing to sit on the bench, it's very rarely ever worthwhile. And secondly, unlike other games, in a game like Counter-Strike or Dota 2, even if we make a massive fuck-up, we sign a player we think's really good, we could go to a couple of LANs within the first month and a half, 2 months, and we could figure out either what's wrong or that it's not going to work, you know, and then if we have to make a drastic move, it's possible. You can do these things. In League, not so much. So with all that said, I put all those caveats out there, so it's not just like we're coming from a world where all these GMs in League have a perfect system, that they know exactly who they get. But with all that said, would it be fair to say that most LCS teams are fairly underwhelming at recruiting players? Seems pretty hit and miss, right?
Yeah, I mean, most of them definitely don't start from the position that you're thinking of. Like, so once you get to the established teams, the ones that haven't just organically risen through Challenger, which are generally the ones that always seem to be guaranteed a free ticket to Worlds, at least in Europe every year. We've had some organically growing team from Challenger that's just had to find players that fit, you know, and haven't had some sort of overarching thing with like, oh, we need to get players for X other reason. They generally always go to Worlds. What most teams end up doing is, so off-season starts, your players are all about to lose their contracts. They're all going to be free agent, and they're all going to want to go elsewhere. They're all going to want to find the best team for them. They generally siphon in on 1 or 2 players, and the problem is when the only thing that you can do is just go by what that player wants to try to keep that player, because it's never going to just be a money thing, not anymore. If they want money now, they're going to go to NA, and you're not going to be able to compete with that from that if you're in EU. So you have to give them the roster they want. So you end up, they will have their own opinion of what is a good player in all of the other roles. That's not really their job to know, nor should it be their job to know. So you're going to run the risk of ending up with a mismatched team, but at least you kept this player happy that you figured was carrying you for the whole time. That's one way that teams start off like poorly. The NRG example that you gave, I believe they went like a completely really retarded way after their initial roster, and they were literally looking for like brand recognition players, because that was straight from a management perspective of we need to make a return on revenue like ASAP.
Yes, I will say also, by the way, actually that is one respect in which I actually cannot criticize the lineup they made, because I actually know that NRG was one of the NA teams which, despite their misgivings competitively, did actually have a pretty good read on things like how to market streamers and how to like sell the streamer aspect to sponsors. And so just the little I happen to personally know from behind the scenes of that team, I believe they actually did very well off some of the players that they had in multiple games purely from the streaming result, because at the time streamers themselves didn't know what they were worth to orgs, and so streamers would accept what to you and I sounds like a lot of money, not knowing maybe the org makes 4 times more off their just the streaming aspect alone. So I can essentially, you can label that as you've let like the business interest override the competitive nature of the team. So that obviously I assume will be part of this discussion, right? What do you want to jump in on, Kelsey?
Whoa.
Well, you're saying that you can't really criticize them to a point, but I think that if you're getting,
I just mean on that front, balance, like they definitely. I mean, like they definitely did succeed on that front, you know. So that's not incorrect.
I mean, but did they to an extent? Because I feel like the competitive nature of the roster eventually will override like have some influence on how well your streaming is doing. Like players like GBM had a fair amount of fame, but at a certain point, people started to call him washed up. They started to be way less interested in what he was doing. So I think that when you can actually lose brand value by putting too many brand value players on your team if they don't work well together or if they're not very good. So you actually can degrade your own brand value by investing too heavily into it.
Sure.
And there's definitely a base assumption that if you go for players, there's definitely a base assumption if you go for players that are well known or have past successes and as a result are well known, that you at least have a safe roster. You know, you're at least not going to get relegated with that, which NRG obviously proved very, very false. So you don't see that so much anymore. But with franchising coming into play, you will start seeing that more and more. And with the lack of relegations now in Europe, that's also a factor that's being taken into account with a couple of recruitments. Also, on my last tangent, I want to say that the third reason that like rosters go badly was the one that you brought up, which was the all-star thing. And from that is also where you get this ridiculous stuff like people trying to do Moneyball, you know, because that all these types of decisions are when an org starts doing it from like, no offense to all the CEOs and CGOs out there, but from those guys' opinion, the people who came in with the money looking to buy a team, thinking that they can also bring in a system of how to spend that money when they don't have actually got experience in the realm in the first place. So then they look at stuff like stats and suddenly you have Moneyball. Obviously, it's not always Moneyball. Sometimes people literally just go for whoever just want MVPs and stuff.
Sure. But the funny thing is actually, on this Moneyball topic, like I actually feel like that's a pretty relevant topic, but in a low-key manner. No one else has seemed to pick up on this. But when they announced the franchises for this season, when they announced the Clutch Gaming squad, which is obviously the team which is basically the Rockets, and famously in the NBA, right, the Rockets GM is called Daryl Morey, and he essentially operates a Moneyball system. Like he actively has said, like he's interested in that topic. And here's the thing, I won't necessarily slam it in basketball, because he has actually finally, through many iterations, gotten to a point where he does have a very competitive team, and you know, potentially maybe they could win the championship this year or next. But they did literally put in their little like paragraph of blurb when Riot announced the teams that they are bringing this. I mean, I'd have to find the wording because I don't want to be too harsh, but they did kind of imply that they have like a revolutionary system that will be able to use statistics and other scouting methods that no one else has ever had before. You know, presumably in esports they were implying, you know, and again, that's just because they come from basketball. Like, you know, the idea that they're bringing anything to the table, like, again, presumably they're talking about using stats here, you know, because there's no other metric by which they would be able to say we have this system. But that's obviously an aspect we can get into, right? There's so much to go there with, Kelsey. Pick what you think's the first thing you want to talk about.
So, I mean, the Moneyball concept in and of itself is really interesting because, first of all, with my understanding of it, is that like they used statistics that were already kind of on the market, but just undervalued to an extent to come up with like the Moneyball system. So based on that information, like all the statistics on the market for League of Legends currently in existence right now are even misinterpreted by experts or people who should be qualified to interpret these. And I mean like casters, like high ranking journalists. Like, I've done it in the past, so I'm not saying that like I'm immune to this, where at a point, like, I just don't think that there are statistics on the market that are good for measuring player performance, period. So you would have to come up with some new types of statistics and metrics for doing this, which like immediately throws out the Moneyball example. And I don't, because of patches and everything else, I just don't see you coming up with like a comprehensive system that doesn't require like machine learning or something super comprehensive to ever do this in League of Legends. So I just like this. As soon as someone says Moneyball to me in the context of esports, I immediately tune them out after that.
Yeah, so. I've actually had to argue this with people in the scene before who were legitimately trying to implement Moneyball systems and actually had money and actually were trying to do this. And eventually what it came down to is I can see how this would work in sports, because the avatar that people are using in sports to interact with the world is essentially a consistent thing. Inconsistencies in said avatar will be shown in the stats and will be a detriment to that guy, right? Because you're overall looking for a guy of a certain like speed, strength, stamina. Obviously a bunch of people are going to go at me that's much more complicated than that or something like this, but essentially that avatar, you're rating that avatar, right? With all of these stats and his performance. Every single stat in League of Legends will be inconsistent, because this avatar one day is basically the Hulk, and then the next day it's a woman who can also turn into a cat every now and again, and the next day it's teleporting all over the fucking
and
pot.
Obviously it's playing the avatar they use versus to interact. 5 different opponents at the same time. That adds into
everything changes.
And
everything changes. A system that's based and predicated on, we can find the consistently good players and the inconsistently good players, are actually just rating the avatar by which they interact with the game and with the world around them, and that changes every fucking game, and the stats will just show you that. So there's no metric right now in any League of Legends statistical board that will tell you whether a player is actually really good or not. They're going to tell you the avatars they're playing. I can tell already that Froggen plays nothing but late game scaling mages and his games last a while from his stats. That doesn't tell me that he's really good at it or not.
Yes.
And it's just another thing where you have to interpret any of the stats you're gathering. Almost everyone, even like hardcore stats, League of Legends stats nerds, like the ones that exist, believe that you can't just look at stats in isolation. You have to use them to contextualize games. So if you're trying, that just automatically means you cannot apply a Moneyball process, like period. So
yeah, I mean, you can use them to like direct board viewing.
Like, I feel as though on this topic, actually, we're all in agreement. So basically just outlining the point is enough. Like, what I would say on this topic is, I actually don't know an esports game that would work on a Moneyball approach. Like, the closest might be Counter-Strike, because at least in Counter-Strike, while yes, team play definitely is important, stuff like how much people frag, it does change a bit from team to team, like depending on the role you play or where you play on the map, etc. But in general, like the really good players can kind of get their numbers no matter what, no matter what, whether their team's bad or whether their team's good. They usually will get similar numbers. But even so, the big problem there is, in a mad way, this might sound counterintuitive, but because then the team play elements are more subtle and might have a smaller effect, in a weird way, the exact opposite of Moneyball, which is being just a scout who qualitatively judges with the eye test, actually might be even more valuable in a game like Counter-Strike, since that might end up being the only little metric and anyone can look at the overall numbers and do the basics, So part of the problem I know with the whole Moneyball example is that it does come from baseball, and baseball, as far as I'm aware, is one of like the few sports that actually can sort of be statistically modeled fairly accurately, and it's not like it's outright being solved, but put it this way, they've had like They have such a large sample size, and the game's so broken up into little aspects that you kind of can judge certain elements of an individual player's impact that don't exist in any, especially not in any team game. Like, as we've said in League of Legends, the whole avatar, I mean, basically in League of Legends, we're talking champion, obviously. The whole champion element is a massive impact. Like, we all know there are good players who will be called shit next split of NALCS, who many of us who know them and have watched their careers will, in the back of our minds, go, we'll just wait 3 months and let's see. I'm sure if this player was changed on his team, or he played a different champion comes in the meta or goes out of the meta, suddenly you will see magically he has become good again and found his passion, like all the lame narratives that we try to kill on the show, hopefully. So, like, moving on from that, because that is definitely... Well, okay, let me ask you this, though. How much has that actually been done in League, do you think, though, veteran? I mean, presumably it's the NA teams that have tried it, right?
Well, EU teams have tried it as well. but I don't think any of it.
Do you have an example you can give us from EU?
I am not giving you an example of that.
I'll go ahead and guess. If I had to guess a team that thinks that would work, it would be, because to me, by the way, a lot of people actually, the whole Moneyball example, the problem is it's such a sexy term that I think even the people who attempt to apply it don't really go and look at all the principles and directly port them, A lot of people, I feel, who do the Moneyball approach, they're just saying that when actually they just end up trying to do an all-star roster, So, for example, I think like of Season 5 Rocket, that was definitely someone trying to make what they thought was an all-star roster. They tried to get the best player available at each position and hoped it would work out. And obviously, in that particular instance, it was all right, but it certainly was nowhere near what they hoped. So, okay, it's just a few teams have tried that approach, because I notice actually it's a lot, as we've referenced with the Clutch Gaming things, it feels like it's a lot of the new people, and especially the sports people who still believe in that concept.
Yeah, I only know of 2 in Europe for sure that have done that, so I can't comment on the West.
I would almost guarantee that there has been someone, like a manager or a CEO or something, in every single esports team who has League of Legends esports team, EU, NA, China, whatever, who has at one point or another brought it up and said, we're going to model this way. And then there'll be someone else on the team, like a coach or an analyst or another manager or another owner, whatever, who says, I think this player is good. And then that person will say, yeah, but his damage percentage, have you seen his damage percentage? And then it's just at that point, like, there's always someone, I feel. There's almost always someone. So I would guarantee that it's like a very frequent thing, even if it doesn't necessarily end up, like, even if that guy ends up just being tuned out, like, it's something that definitely comes up. For sure. Quite frequently.
That's absurdly familiar. So, yeah.
So I think a good jump off from that point, though, is on the other end of the equation, the approach that the Moneyball component of doing recruiting tried to address was that obviously in traditional sports they did have long-held traditions. And so, for example, in baseball, famously, supposedly it was very heavily impacted by these coaches who were talent scouts. And the idea was that's a guy who's, like 65 years old and he's watched so much baseball that you hope he's going to pick out the young talent that you should draft or should sign, and, things like that, which essentially it's just the eye test. It's just using your skills as engaging who do you think's good, etc. Now, the reason why I want to jump into that is because I feel like that's also another area which has also been a flaw at times in Western recruitment. Like, I can tell you, especially actually in your home region, veteran of Europe, there have been many teams where people who I actually personally think do know quite a lot about League, like they probably could generally guess who the good players are, fall way too in love with like a rookie or a challenger player on the basis that they think what they do is they just look at the upside and they just say, right, if he hit this ceiling, not only would he be amazing, and obviously, we can potentially get him cheaper because he's not yet a star, but they also, I think, this is the part they never mention, I think they secretly do it because they also want to be like, I found him, there's a level of ego involved where they're too close to the player in that respect, and they want to be like, I found him for nothing, and he's an amazing player. Like, put it this way, veteran, if I'd have come to certain people in esports in Season 5 and said, who should we get? Should we get Ryu as our mid laner or Sencox? I tell you, if I went to the people who recruited for Season 5 European teams, they would all take Sencox. They would all use the logic of, like, his upside's so crazy, look how good he is, like, he could be the next superstar mid. But if you actually looked at it, I think you could make a pretty solid case for either at the most point in time. I don't think it's conclusive as to who was better in any way, right? But one's an established value, probably is not going to go high, and one's just an unknown that people were willing to gamble on. But like I say, a lot of people were willing to gamble on that aspect.
Right, so if you were to ask that to me, I would generally always go with the rookie, and it's not because I want to be the guy who discovered Sencox or whatever. So this is a topic
we actually addressed in your last episode, right, where you said that you would actually put together a super team of rookies rather than take all these established players or Koreans.
Yeah, because for me, a person who has spent his entire career in Europe and who knows a lot of the European players well, and it's really easy for me at this point to get a background check on literally any European player that I want. I've generally interacted with most of the rookies that I've been looking at the very least this off season. I know how they're going to fit into this team environment, which goes back into the first thing you said, where you wonder if teams are actually looking at how you should be able to fit these players together and how they will interact with each other. And I think that personality aspect of it, that cultural aspect of it, is actually very important when you're making that fit. Yes. I can't know that with Ryu. because the people that you're going to talk to about Ryu in that regard are all going to be trying to sell him to me anyway. Ryu will become whatever these people think that I just need. It's going to be very difficult for me to marry the cultural aspects that Ryu's got from Korea, where things run very differently from Europe, in like a time frame of a few weeks, and somebody else might take him, somebody else might take Senkuks, etc. So I would always go for Senkuks, because I can look that up fast and I can start competing for him faster, and I'm not risking losing out on a lot, because it's going to take so much longer to verify Ryu in all those aspects that I do believe are important.
In a sense, I almost don't think is he a rookie or is he a star question is like that important at face value. I think that question in itself is irrelevant. The real question that you need to be asking is...
Wait a minute, why is it irrelevant though?
I'm explaining. The real question...
You went on to the next point.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to segue into an explanation.
Okay.
The real question you need to be asking, I think, is are you like kind of half-assing this pick? Are you doing it for a reason that isn't he is the best player for this position in the context of this team for this, and this? Or are you doing it because, oh man, his KDA is really sick and everyone says he's really sick? Are you doing it because, but he has this upside and I could be like this guy who discovered like if your answers are anything that are incomplete or like personal or just like really weird, and you don't actually have a valid reason why, like personality-wise, game-playing-wise, or anything like that this guy is good for your team, then it doesn't really matter like whether it's a rookie or a star player. It's just kind of like, if you're half-assing that element of it, if you're half-assing the research at all, then it's probably not gonna work out that well.
Stage experience absolutely does make me value certain players more, though, which is why I hold up the national leagues to such an extent on Twitter whenever any rookie player like asks if a national league team is worth it for them or if they should just try it in solo queue. It's absolutely worth it, because teams should know how you're going to behave once you get on the stage. You may be a solo queue god, but I've definitely seen players in the past completely change once they get on that stage. So I'm not saying that's like star value or something, but that's definitely an experience factor that I'll always take into account.
But again, you're giving an explanation here. It's not this weird, like, if you're picking a player because he's a star, or if you're picking a player because he's a rookie, then I think that's like already a detriment. Like, that can't be the reason you're picking a player, I guess is how I feel.
Yeah,
sure.
Unless you're building for branding, in which case you've already given up on the other aspect.
You've already embraced the dark side.
I mean, obviously this is like competitive roster building, but I think even then, like with the branding element, you're like, oh, okay, I've got this like player who I think can be really good and I want to develop him. I've got this player who's like probably going to carry the team in this role, and then like neither of these players have super like high personalities. My owner wants me to have a return. There's this player who can like kind of complement my roster and already has a big streaming follow. So that's like still like some sort of argument you're doing. It's just like, for me, just saying the fact that this player, like getting caught up on, oh, but if I discover this guy and he's like really good, just like or he's already good, I think it's just like when you add in all these other factors that are really important for roster building, becomes less and less like just kind of dims into the background.
Okay. Because one of the aspects, obviously, that I know is it's a very divisive topic, is whenever you get into the whole, like, should we import players? So obviously, typically we were talking about Koreans there, but obviously it applies to EU players, to NA to a lesser degree. Whenever it comes to the import angle, I know that one thing that really annoys some people is it is obviously different if you recruit a person who was a very good player in Korea, and whether or not he's good enough in Korea, you're trying to gauge, would he still be able to make it in an LCS team, etc. Right, that's one thing, but obviously, it is rampant throughout League for the last few years to recruit people almost just because they're Koreans and they did some solo queue. That's about it, right? There's so many instances we can see of that. And to be fair, on that one, like, I doubt we're going to get much argument on that one, because it feels like for that one, they overwhelmingly failed, with the exception of maybe like 2 instances or so. There's very few who were complete no-namers who were Koreans who came over and were good, right, veteran?
Yeah, and the issue is that the first big example of it was also one of the earliest ones. Huni and Rainover was literally a result of looking at the ladder and finding like the first supposedly unsigned Korean there, which was Huni, and Huni was friends with Reignover and he brought him over with him. And that became a beacon to all these teams. And it's an example, and it still is.
It's an example, but the thing about that one is that even if they were recruited a lot based on where they were on the ladder, or Huni was on the ladder, the fact that he was already within like the system is, as it were, and he was already in a gaming house to an systems to an extent, and already being trained in these factors. Like a lot of the quote unquote no-name stars actually that were Korean and went to another region actually have that background. Like Doinby was in CJ Entis, which a lot of people don't realize, even though he had like his breakout in the LPL. So I think that those are a lot of the factors that people who may not be like super acquainted with a player's background don't realize. So they use Huni as an example that no one has ever heard of and was successful in another region, but they don't look into his background and say, actually, this people knew about this guy. Like, it wasn't one of those situations. So
I also feel like I'm going insane sometimes, because I remember at Worlds it was pretty much agreed that Forbidden and Reckless were like the star players at that World Championships where Fnatic got to the semi-finals, and especially the EDG games were a perfect example of this, where if there was a breakdown anywhere, it was definitely with Huni and Reignover. But now every time that I read about it, I feel like it just happened again, by the way, because even on you guys' last show, you talked about how bad Huni was. Yeah, I've seen loads of posts on Reddit that Huni being dropped from SKT would be really unfair because Huni had a amazing Worlds performance. I've legit seen so many posts of that on Reddit. Okay. I feel like these guys just end up like untouchable when it comes to reality. Like the EDG series, I remember Forbidden solo killing Pawn a ridiculous amount of double-digit times while Huni and Reignover were like collapsing to the substitute theoretically weaker part of EDG on the top side. So
I think there's always going to be a degree of, well, he's established a certain amount of success in this particular field, so there will always be rose-colored glasses. Like, that will happen for pretty much anyone who becomes like a fan favorite in some regard, one way or the other. So you can't really like combat that. But the issue is that we're talking about is less the Reddit comments and more the people who are building the rosters who theoretically should be immune to that, right?
The thing is that they're not. That's why it matters, actually. I forgot to point out the fact that Reddit and stuff and the narrative and stuff went this way, and like Riot will even come to like the defense of players like that matters, because all of these owners that are coming in, they are legit using Reddit and social media and like the general narrative of things as a basis for which player is good and which player is bad. Like that legitimately happens. That's their biggest source. That's their source before they meet the people behind the scenes. And obviously they're going to go in thinking that if this is an established fact, it just is, you know, when we don't have like a top tier of like analysis in League of Legends on like the Riot broadcast consistently. Obviously you have stuff like Papa Smithy and Crumbs and Kelsey over here, obviously not on the Riot narrative, but like at like the top end of analysis. It's not like so well fleshed out that it's been guiding the narrative for years. Sure. So these people are coming in with basically amateurs' perspective of things, but amateurs who have been on camera. And that is really to blame for like a lot of roster decisions made by owners who think like, oh, I really should get, I don't know, Looper for like $1 million buyout when I could just wait and get him for free because I keep hearing his TPs are so good. Like,
I think, but this is the factor is it's like it shouldn't be that way. Like it obviously is, so we have to work within the framework. But the question is, I guess, like, is there a solution that I have then? Is there a solution to this problem? Like, how do we create this kind of like foundation so that these kind of people have somewhere to go to that isn't Reddit? Like, is it, and if should they take part of Reddit into account? Because again, the branding and the streaming, and you do want your players to be popular, right? You do want some kind of return. So like how do we come up with some kind of solution here?
I mean, it has to arrive organically, and so we get onto my favorite topic, which is that Riot artificially inflated everything, and as a result, there are people who shouldn't be in a lot of positions who are, because Riot dumped so much money in the scene, decreed you have to have a coach, you have to have a manager, all of this type of stuff. So people got what were essentially like supposed to be temporary people to fill these until we figured out who were good. And then these temporary people who filled these things suddenly became temporary people with one split of experience, then one season of experience, and they will always have that over everybody who wasn't there initially, who may have turned out to be good. Nothing was allowed to grow organically in League of Legends, hence you didn't have an organic top end of analysis, hence you didn't have organically really strong coaches everywhere, or scouting or scouters, like that whole area, because Riot hasn't touched it. It's probably one of the only places that's growing organically, and right now it is basically at the bottom end, but people are of the impression that it must be top tier because everything else is being artificially inflated to the top end.
Yeah. I mean, this is an area where I actually, my own personal opinion on what the flaws in the West are. And by the way, when I set this up, absolutely all these flaws exist in Korea. They just get around it in their own very unique Korean way, which they just happen to. They're like on a completely divergent chain of evolution to us in that sense. There's almost no point looking at their system and thinking we can apply it, or that it developed because it was the best. It's just better than what we have. So basically, from watching a lot of different team games, so esports, Counter-Strike, Dota, League of Legends, but obviously other sports that I'm interested in, I actually think that the number one factor that makes successful teams, believe it or not, doesn't start with the players, actually. It's not like you start with the superstar player and then build the players around him, as like a very naive layman would think. You know, you'd think to yourself, oh, if I can get Michael Jordan, right, I just have to put this player around him, then this player. Actually, the best way to get the number one team in a league is usually to have a culture within your team that starts with the coach. That's why if you look at any really long sports franchise that's had a lot of success, they tend to always have had some like Hall of Fame type coach who, let's say, was there for 10 or more years. Yeah. And the idea is, no matter which players come through the door, so at times they might have superstars, at times he might have to work with scouted players, like drafted players, you know, at times he might have to do kind of a Moneyball approach, you know, and just sign someone for cheap who he sees extra value in that other people don't. But the key element is he knows what his blueprint is to make a team. He knows what type of team he wants to run. He has a philosophy on like, this is the type of jungler I want. I'm given the equivalent in League here, you know, and then this is the sort of player who would fit my overall style of play. And the idea is, if you always work from that blueprint, I actually think you end up with better squads with some consistency, because even if then you don't get the star player for that position, you get someone who might be capable of doing what you want in the game. So you might not win in that scenario, but maybe you'd be the fourth best team then. The difference is when you then have the players that all work out, you can be the best team. Right? What do you think on that approach? Obviously, by the way, that is a very abstract approach, and as it stands right now, sort of can't exist in League, because you'd have to like give coaches massive amounts of power. They'd also, to some degree, have to be the general manager scouting the players, you know. It would require a change in philosophy, but at the moment, that almost can't exist, because, first of all, coaches just get fired after splits if they're bad, you know. They don't always get to choose which players they have. They almost have to do the opposite and just work backwards from the players. They have to find a system that works. What would you say to this veteran?
I mean, I basically insist on having full roster control with every single team that's ever offered me. Like even back when I was coming in to be an analyst for H2k, I wanted like a lot of say in the roster, even though I was just going to be an analyst. And I feel like that also, a lot of the time, that's definitely being a reason why I haven't got certain jobs. And that a lot of like owners don't agree with you there, and that they definitely feel like they have an idea of where a roster should go. Sure. Coaches need to be more flexible about this sort of thing, and that you can't just like shut off certain avenues. And this definitely goes back to the whole, a lot of owners value like brand level players and stuff like this. So I do agree with you. I think that if you have like obviously I'm saying this as a coach, so obviously I'm saying to you that I think coaches should be able to stick with a team for like 10 years on a really long contract. Please just give me all the money. But I do agree that there has to at least be somebody on the ground who can say the team was like this, its organic growth should be this direction, it's been going in this direction, this stuff can work because I've seen it evolve through like all of these phases. And yeah, the fact we haven't just got that yet is definitely a detriment to a lot of teams, and why we haven't got a dynasty team in the same way that like SKT is a dynasty team or Samsung is a dynasty team. That guy's been there since their season 4 successes. I'm not sure if he was there in season 3, but I'm pretty sure he was as well. And he's being able to say, right, this is the next direction to take the team. And Samsung was able to stay relevant even after like the whole exodus, and they lost like what people consider to be one of the best teams of all time. We just don't have that in the West yet. I don't think that's necessarily just the fault on the coaches' side of things, though obviously it is a lot. But there's definitely owners really do want more control over that and don't necessarily see it as, oh, it will be best for me getting an immediate return if the coach has like all the say here and if I just trust them. It's obviously not true of every owner, but it's preventing things.
I think that the counter to that, again, is that a lot of the coaches that are brought onto teams now are there because you have to fill a position. And I don't necessarily think there are coaches who are qualified yet or willing to make that responsibility. So I don't necessarily mind right now a system where the roster gets built and the coach is brought on to kind of like learn stuff and get to a position where you can like be that kind of person. So I don't necessarily think like because of the situation that's been forced into with like Riot doing all this sort of stuff, you need a coach and you need all this and you need this illusion of like often the guy who's voted because the split is the one who makes the most entertaining analyst desk appearance. So he makes people think he has like some sort of authority or some sort of like whatever. So it doesn't necessarily. I think the concept that Riot has created of a coach doesn't exactly exist yet. So right now the system
some people aren't coaches; they just play them on TV.
Okay, there you go. Excellent. So I think the concept of the coach that like you're talking about doesn't necessarily fully fledged like exist in the West in a lot of instances yet. Like there are probably a lot of people who are capable of doing it, but at the same time, like it's unreasonable to expect every team to be like that. The other thing that I would consider in this situation is just generally speaking, we also have this concept that like the manager came before the coach in League of Legends, and we had managers before we had coaches, and managers are supposed to build a roster. So even a lot of the coaches that come on are like, just give me a team, I'll teach the team to play League of Legends. And the manager is supposed to build the roster. But if the manager like comes out and says, I don't really know anything about the game, why are we expecting them to be able to build a roster? Like that doesn't make sense. And I just think this is because this is like a holdover that managers came before coaches, and organizations haven't necessarily like caught up and realizing that this is old and bad and outdated logic. So
well, I mean, I'll give just to play devil's advocate for one moment for the org. Like, just as with the org, I can actually totally understand from having spoken to a lot of owners over the years why they go with the route of, like, you know, if in doubt, take the star player. Is because the one thing that a successful owner knows is I definitely can market this guy and sell him to sponsors, and I can make sure that part gets taken care of. So that's kind of like, to them, that's safer. But then on this exact topic of the coach that you're mentioning right now, there's also the fact that some of these people have essentially been boosted by the success of their teams. So I won't go into necessarily mentioning names. You know, one of them, like the logo's black and orange, you know. Like that squad, people will come and join your squad and will desperately put you top of the list if you already had the best players of all time from Europe. That doesn't mean you're wicked at scouting and coaching. And guess what? When you no longer have those players, you might make a few missteps and you might get players that aren't that good because the managers you thought were geniuses actually hadn't really been tested yet. They hadn't really had to manage yet. They'd just come in and sort of steered success. And I'm sure, by the way, that's a quality that definitely is of value, but it's not the same as knowing how to build a squad from scratch, you know, which is part of what I think delays what sometimes some of the successful orgs from rebuilding and retooling, you know.
Sure. I mean, obviously this isn't true, but say that like in season 5 when Riot were finally like, you have to have managers and you have to have coaches, all right? That people just literally threw 10 managers and 10 coaches who'd never been managers and coaches before. There were 2 exceptions to the coaches part.
Sure.
And 10 managers didn't know what they were doing before. The guy who wins out of all of that and has a stellar record at the end of that is still a guy who didn't know what the fuck he was doing half a year ago. So it's like this guy isn't suddenly a guy that you can just give a roster and a blank check to and expect like joy. Again, because Riot artificially inflated the scene, those types of results therefore don't actually give a really good indication of which staff knew what they were doing.
Sure. So let me ask you this then, right? Well, we've kind of talked around it, but not really addressed it. So can you give me some, like, either an example or a hypothetical example to explain this principle? How does someone end up with a team where, for example, on paper, in isolation, they have a player who's like an established jungler, maybe even a good jungler, maybe they have an established mid laner, maybe was even a good mid laner, but then you look at the two players together, and anyone with analytical skills would be like, "Oh, this is going to be tough to make work." And they'd be like, "Well, why? They're good players." You go, "Oh, well, this guy's actually like, just likes to farm, and this guy needs a lot of ganks." So, this player is self-sufficient, but the other guy got all his success through feeding the mid lane. These sorts of scenarios, yes, you can definitely tweak them, right? But generally, you'd want to kind of stay within people's wheelhouses in these respects, right? When you're recruiting to a team veteran.
So I guess, at your specific example, the first thing that came to mind was actually Froggen and Schalke, in which case it's literally that Schalke was 1v9ing every game in solo queue, therefore Froggen was like, we need this player, Sure. It'll literally be stuff like that. That's actually kind of happening right now. Once junglers start 1v9ing in solo queue, people will be like, oh, this jungler's carrying every game and I can't do anything against this guy in solo queue. So we need them. When the jungle is probably like the single role where you have to be the most adaptable, and he might just be having like a really strong meta or something like that, and that will raise the stock of players considerably among the other players. And the real issue there is that because of everything I've just described to you, and every other staff low-key knows every other staff still kind of figuring everything out, the players become the ultimate authority in all of their eyes, and therefore that guy kind of gets elevated and gets the job because everyone wants him. So obviously he must be good, And what he's doing is he's 1v9ing and fucking solo queue.
I mean, two little fact pointers on that. One, there's been a lot of amazing teams that have won championships domestically and internationally that didn't have the best jungler or even close. Like that's what I've always found funny about that one role.
Bengi, score is master.
The bizarrest one to me, the second one, was the one that you said about the player aspect, because that's the one area, because it's players, that there's never any blowback. Like the number of pro players who have asked, get me this guy here, and then it completely shits the bed. But maybe the pro player himself still looks good. And at the end of the season, all of his fans and all the team's fans are like, oh, that guy's so good. Why is he stuck with this shit player? And obviously the player's not going to come forward and go, well, sort of my fault, guys. I actually vouched for him. I thought he was good. But you never find out publicly those stories. You have to find them out through stories behind the scenes. That's the only way you'll ever find them out, sadly.
Sure. You go on first.
That example is because we touched a little bit on like the Korean player recruitment stuff to kind of ease back on like the condemning of the organizations, which we did, which obviously they still share responsibility for this example, but you would think like when you come to an NA player, an EU player, a Chinese player, and you say that, okay, we're going to get this specific player with this specific name, and he's European as well, or he's Chinese as well, and then you have specific names that are all Chinese. This would be a better example than, oh, we have this vague unnamed Korean mid laner, by the way, that we're going to definitely get a Korean here. You would think that the more concrete example would be better, but there are a lot of players who for a while legit just preferred like this idea of we're going to import a support for you. And so in that context, you can almost see like the players, again, having a lot of power in the sense because they bought into the whole hype of like a random Korean is definitely better. Like players actually also buy into a lot of the Reddit hype and a lot of the like narrative hype as well. So you end up in this situation where it's like, yeah, but we're going to get a Korean mid. Yeah, like this org is going to offer me a Korean mid. What are you going to offer me? And then like it's a fairly well-known European player, like say not top tier, maybe we're going to say like, I don't know, Senkooks or something like this. Like most people consider him like pretty decent. But then like this other guy says, yes, but we're going to get a Korean import. And it ends up being like Nahyun or something. But it could be Nahyun, it could be Ryu, it could be like people don't actually have a name in mind, so they will be more likely to go with like for a while. I don't think this is true anymore, but for a while people were more likely to go with like the vague unnamed Korean import option rather than like a player they knew would at least be above average, right?
Yeah, so. Because they want it to be the next Huni, who, by the way, as I've already said, is not a player that ever actually existed. But in their head, they're like, oh, maybe we just have the next Huni the end it's like free. But yeah, did I say staff get influenced by Reddit? I forgot. Players do as well, but whereas you're like 40-year-old staff member, CEO guy who just threw his money in as his equivalent of a midlife crisis is doing it from a place of incompetence. Players are doing it because they are kids, you know, a lot of them are still kids. So they are obviously going to be easily influenced by the Riot narrative and by the majority of Reddit posts. Not like, oh, they read all the Reddit posts and think, oh, wow, Reddit is smart. No, but once the narrative folds that way because it's a majority opinion, yeah, they're absolutely influenced by that majority opinion at the same time. So you do end up with ridiculous instances like what Kelsey just mentioned, where there was legit a time where if you said, oh, we're going to get a random Korean for this role, by the way, or they will obviously say, they'll be like, oh, we're getting a Korean for this role. That was like it, you know, you had this person. You could, if you said we have an LCK player coming into this role, for so many people, they don't care if it's from like the 10th place team or whatever. They don't even consider this. They just think LCK and they're thinking SKT and Samsung and KT and all of this stuff already, you know, and they're already in. You could legit sell players for this, and this messed up things further.
Okay, because I also feel like in that sense, like I'm definitely not on board with the idea that these Koreans just aren't as good and that, you know, Koreans themselves aren't good and that it's just only the team system. But I will say that some of these players, like in general, I think if you look overall, it's not just because they play with worse teammates that even the good Koreans don't tend to look as good in the West. You know, there's clearly a massive impact to the cultural component and how differently the teams are coached. Because I actually think a lot of these players who probably are hot prospects in Korean solo queue or in some challenger team there, if they actually did go to the Samsungs of the world or KT Rolster, they might end up being amazing players. And 3 years later, you'd be like, fuck, I should have got that guy. The difference is if you got him, you wouldn't do any of the things that take place that get him from this point to that point. So that's why, unfortunately, the upside's kind of the fool's gold, right? You're not ever going to really access that unless you're very, very lucky.
Yeah, and that's again going back to why players who were already within like farm teams are by and large way more successful, like coming out of Korea, than players who only have Korean solo queue experience, because you have to teach these kinds of players way more to get them to play within a team environment, and you can't speak their language, so you have to get over it. And a lot of teams will just like resolve to this point of, we have a very specific system, and like at this time we're going to put wards here under this like particular play or this particular configuration because that's the best you can do and that's the best you can communicate to get across to this player. And like I'll even use an example that isn't a rookie Korean player, or because I interviewed Misfits a lot about like the Maxlor Kakao situation, and they went on the record with me and said like part of the reason why they felt it was more successful with Maxlor was just because when they had Kakao, they could only talk about like very specific standard states and like how to get from one state to another state, but not necessarily how to adapt between states. And like teaching them this process and having these conversations was a much more slow process because of the language barrier. So they felt like that's why they were overall more successful with Maxlor. It wasn't necessarily because they felt like Kakao was a shit player or anything like that. And I don't think like anyone would say Kakao was just a flat out shit player, but like this is the type of situation that ends up being. And then imagine if you don't have Kakao, imagine if you have a complete rookie jungler who you then also have to explain why each of these states exist and everything else, and like unfold it that way. It just gets much more complicated and much more difficult to like train players in a foreign language, especially if you're on an EU team, and so many EU teams don't even have translators. So
sure.
And this like touches on the reason why I end up getting really angry a lot on this topic. Like, it was definitely thought of for a while that if you got a Korean on, they'd increase like the strategy level of your team. And what you just heard there was that when the staff actually did have concepts that they wanted to teach players, it was actually a detriment to them that they had someone on that they needed to communicate in a different manner, who was unused to this type of system, etc., and all of that stuff. When people were going on this huge like import thing from staff down, they were making up for deficiencies there. And you were essentially denying European players roles and potentially much better European teams from existing because you guys weren't good enough. And instead of taking the blame yourselves and trying to actually get better, you were trying to patch it out. And it really amazed me when players started buying into the whole, oh, I need an LCK one. On one side, you could be like, yeah, well, the players have also figured out that most stuff is bad, and if they want the strategic element, they want to find it anywhere else. But most players aren't realizing, what if they're on the other side? What if some other European players viewed more valuable than them, and this org needs them? Well, maybe your role is the one that gets removed because they just need a Korean player, no matter who that is, even if you've been working really hard for this your entire time. And it just angers me because this all really ends up boiling down to staff thought that they had a free way to not do their fucking job properly. And it pisses me off because I feel like it delayed Europe for like 2 years.
And I want to back up a little bit because I feel like there were just basic things that staff in the West and in China actually learned from importing Korean players for a while. And then just that, like, they kind of gained from having the Korean player on their team. Like, very basic things were communicated about scrim culture, but a lot of these were like basic things. And if you want to constantly refresh like the technology and with the constant patching, I don't think like importing a player is necessarily a long-term solution to keeping up to date in strategic play. Like, eventually the knowledge level will normalize out from what they can teach to the rest of the team, and you have to still rely on staff and then the team working together in some format to advance strategy even further from that, like to keep the team from stagnating. So I think there were definitely some benefits, I think, from that angle of importing Korean players at one time, but I think that the way that the game has developed, just like across the board internationally, strategy has advanced too much to a point now where language barriers are just way more noticeable than they were in almost every single major region. So I think that that's a factor to consider.
Okay. Because when I had brought up before, I mean, I guess I came at it from the other angle of like just obvious stylistic elements that would fit with players, and especially I gave obviously the jungler mid laner one because that's like a classic interaction that people can understand. If you're really off with that, you're going to have a hard time just getting a compromise that works, you know. And most crucially, it's probably not going to make both players play to their peak. I mean, you could actually, what's funny is a lot of these issues, just to not be unreasonable, you could relate to Korean teams. Like they obviously literally did that on SK Telecom this year. They got the best player of all time at mid lane and put a player with him as the jungler who didn't really seem to fit what he needed. Like, it was almost everything except what that player needed, because he wasn't some exceptional vision player who was just going to play around him. Instead, he was this, like, carry jungler who wasn't really needed in the team either, because in history, they wanted a tank top laner. So really, you look at that squad and you would actually say, Coma, well, if he was the one who was involved with choosing the player, absolutely abjectly failed for the reasons we're outlining here. Like, he didn't understand stylistically what players he was getting and what he was going to do with them. But I would say you could go even further. So, for example, as well as balancing out styles of play, you also have to balance out, like, the way a player wants to play. So this might sound bizarre, right? But if you look this season, I think even from the first day it was announced, it was obvious that KT Rolster lineup, while it's an amazing all-star name lineup, not literally all-stars now, but, you know, the names are all amazing. From day one, everyone thinks, how's this going to work? You know, how are they going to make all that work together? Because stylistically, doesn't make sense. In terms of the personalities of the player, doesn't really make sense. Like, for example, think about how in the end they got to some kind of a vaguely cogent approach in KT Rolster. It was to play through the bot lane and through Deft and Matter, which then meant that you left the two-time reigning MVP of the league playing on his own at the top of the map, when he played with an entire team, including much inferior players, playing around him in his last squad and almost won Worlds twice. You know, like anyone who would sit down and design a squad like that shows that even some of the Koreans aren't doing this method. They just have so many advantages in other areas, they can somehow brute force it through or fluke their way through. And the other, because for example, okay, hey, a veteran, I'll tie this into a European example. I, to this day, still think, on paper, one of the best lineups I've ever seen balanced out was the Season 6 H2k team of the spring split, because that's a team where before it's played a single game, you could logically think this actually should work. Like, yes, Odoamne might be one of the best top laners, but he's also one of the best top laners who's not going to need to be like ganked all the time and have massive resources. So then that allows you to have a player as an AD carry who's going to get all the resources go through him. You know, like the whole team in a way, like if there were problems, the problems weren't necessarily starting out with how the players are going to play and then having to like find all these compromises on the map, right?
You know what the big thing there though with Odo, it wasn't just that like we knew he played these types of champions. I knew from talking to him that he was willing to play in this specific way. Like I distinctly remember a call that I had with him in the preseason when we were talking about grabbing Forgiven, that he had apparently literally said to Forgiven, he told me that look, you literally just play whatever carry you want, play as far forward as you want. I'll just pick Shen every game if I can or something like that. Like I'm willing to play like a dog champ like this all the time. Like he genuinely wanted to be that way. He genuinely wanted to fit into the team that way. This is just not something that I'm going to know for a fact when I'm recruiting an import who just wants to be hired no matter what, you know? Like Odo1 was actually invested in building a team around him because this is how H2k was going to organically grow. And this was happening over a vast period of time. The super team like meme that happened in Korea right now, where Samsung ended up winning, which is the only one that didn't do any of these sorts of things. Yes. Like I feel like with with SKT, like they really wanted to keep Faker. I'm not entirely like I don't exactly remember the history, but was this when his contract was renewed and we heard all those absurd numbers? Because
I think it was before this season. Right?
Yeah. So then I also think that he also really wanted Peanut for a while. Peanut was really well known in solo queue and
by
stuff.
the way, that's probably a very fair point to make. That whole player issue, I have no doubt, extends to the likes of Faker. Because for example, funny thing is, Faker in that example, by the way, has done exactly what Froggen did with Schalke, which is think to himself naively, oh, these fucking not so great junglers, Snoopy and Bengi, you know what, if I just had one of those guys who in every game I play in competitive can sometimes just wreck me, imagine what we'd do together. And it's like, yeah, but Faker, you haven't stopped and thought, mate. Like, actually, maybe that guy suited you more, you know. As bizarre as it sounds, this is why, actually, guess what? No one would, well, I would hope no one would put Faker as the GM of their team. You'd put him as the starting mid laner. Why the fuck would you put him as the GM of the team? He didn't build the teams he was on until this one, which was the one that didn't win.
I feel like I have sympathy. Like, I feel like if I was Coma after all of that time, I too would be thinking to myself, am I really this good? Or have I just had the best mid in the world on my team every single goddamn time and he's just that good? And I could understand, like, panicking to the point where you just give him, like, a role and be like, who do you want in this role? If you really want to Peanut, fuck it. Like, we've done this several times before. I'll grab, like, a really strong carry top because, you know, this guy only plays carries, and if everything fails mid, at least the top side of the map is so strong, Peanut can do whatever he wants, you know?
Okay. So to a point, I can see this, but I also, like, at the time that the roster come out, I thought in my head, like, ways in which this can work. Because on paper, Peanut and Huni sort of fit, like, very, very basic concepts of roles that they've had. Like, there was a statistical analysis by Leota, who's been on the show before, in season 5, where when they had Marin, basically Bengi's almost like consistently, like over 50% of the time, his first gank was to top side. Every single game, like there was a lot of pressure put on top side. It was very top centric in this way and getting the top laner ahead. Like Duke was a very strong, like almost carry oriented top laner to a point, and they still would rather have the jungle like play towards top side rather than specifically play towards Faker outside of placing vision. So in my head, like, you have Peanut, who's used to playing around Smeb. You have Huni, who's used to having jungle pressure like 24/7. So you can kind of see this type of scenario where it would work. The problem is it really did break down in the vision and the element of setting up vision, and Huni and Peanut turned out to be like just that one-dimensional almost. So I think that ended up being the issue. So yeah, it's possible that Faker wanted these players, but I also think that it's unfair to SKT to say that there was like no plan or no idea in place on how to make them work.
But I also think that definitely takes away from a lot of the control they had on the bottom half of the map then, if they really are going to be that one-dimensional, especially when the meta changed. Like, I think that would have ended up being their downfall, and I think that's too one-dimensional way to think about things. You need a team that is going to be more malleable than that at the very least, because the meta does change every goddamn month.
I mean, I would argue that the SKT teams weren't necessarily always that malleable. I think, but
if you're going to pivot around mid, that's the best way to do it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they pivoted around mid, but they did have a lot of, like, play to top sort of mentality. Bot lane was never, like, I feel like since season 4, which was the last time that that SKT didn't make worlds, like, there was never really a play around bot specifically mentality that was like super, super ingrained and super necessary until this Worlds. So, I mean, arguably you could even say that like that compounded with the problem of having poor synergy and topside. And there was just like too many problems that they didn't necessarily foresee, but they probably would have always had that problem on previous rosters as well, in 2K15 and 2K16 rosters.
I do think they definitely needed control of bot side though, because, and they didn't do it to play around bot side, but they did definitely need that to kind of chip mid tower down as fast as they can, which has always been the quintessential strategy. And if your AD carry suddenly can't come in and do your quintessential SKT strategy, it's really not going to work out very well unless Huni is on very specific champions, which initially when they were doing their first big runoff were actually kind of meta, where he could play stuff like Jason Nar just every goddamn game, and Nar ended up being Huni's most successful champion. So,
because I actually feel like that's an area where also people are a bit too reductive. So for example, certain people who just generally outline storylines would tell you that the reason why SK Telecom is so good is they have Faker, and then the reason why TSM is always so good is they have Bjergsen, right? That's obviously a component, and definitely if you're looking at how they perform at mid, that's definitely a massive reason why they're so good. But I also think if you look at those two teams, which in their different regions have been overwhelmingly the most successful domestically, they also, because they had those players, never had to change that factor, and they've had coaching staff. In the case of TSM, it's different coaches, but one of the issues in TSM has been Reginald has absolutely had his own blueprint for how to play the game. You've had in a sense a kind of culture that I was referring to in sports, but on the league level. Now, obviously, you can't really do that in every team, but I don't think that could be a coincidence that these teams have had that level of consistent success, whether they were the best or the second best or the third best or whatever.
I also think TSM has one of the only owners for whom winning is much more valuable than literally anything else he could be doing of his roster. Like, he definitely didn't build that super team that he did for branding purposes. He just legit thought, fuck it, this is the best way to do things. And I think that drive is also why Reginald is being a consistent, like, middle factor for the entire team. Like, he has seen every iteration up close at every point up close, and has ended up being like that coach that you were mentioning that could just be there all throughout the years, because he is like the only owner who really just wants to win and nothing else, and just looks at it purely on the league perspective to the point where I believe he lost like one of the best CSGO teams ever, and they're on some other name now, you'll know more about that, but he seems to be super single-minded about the League of Legends part to that extent that no other owner is. It's not an owner's job to be this, but Reginald has ended up fulfilling a role within League of Legends that is missing in a lot of teams in the West. And I agree that that's a good reason for why TSM is so consistent.
I mean, that's a bit depressing, though, because that does make it seem like I've got a solution for you, veteran. You just basically have to get so much money you can buy your own teammate, and then you can do all the shit however you want it. You know, you can have all the players you want, and you can have the culture you want. You just have to have millions and buy your own squad. Rich.
I think... I think it's a fair point to make that the teams that we've thought of as consistently successful, either domestically or internationally, have always had like a very well-defined identity or system. And even if they change rosters or whatever, they still have this like core. Like, no one on the TSM roster is the same as they were when in 2012 or whatever, but they still have a very, very similar identity. And I think that that's a fair point to make. And even Samsung, which I would say is like we hold up adaptability super highly, but I would say that even Samsung, which I would consider like an extremely adaptable roster, has a sense of a system and has a sense of a specific identity with like the way that Ambition plays to help reset the lanes, and the way that like Crown has to play a specific side laning champion that can side lane later on to keep Baron control and things of that nature. But I think that like the question then becomes like to get longevity, or to get like real sense of longevity in League of Legends, eventually we'll have to answer the question, like, should you aim for this idea of adaptability, which has never really been that good, or should you keep like working for these rosters that we're calling one-dimensional, and then solve problems as you come to them? Because I think that we've put down one-dimensionality a lot, but it's true that got SKT so many world championships.
Well, here's a question I have for you then, veteran. Okay, so in this sense, this is actually, Kelsey's helped me in my mind kind of resolve down one of the ways in which I think Koreans get to sort of cheat on this aspect, which is that in a world where you have to make a team and you can only use that team for the entire year. I can think of a number of Korean teams that probably wouldn't have had the success they did. What they tend to do is, though, Korea's the only region I've seen where they will even remove the franchise player. Remember, they used Easyhoon for like half of the split in Season 5 in that first split because they actually thought, in the concept of what they were trying to do in the meta, that at times it fit the team better to not have Faker, the best player in the world. Now, the difference is, if you are Echo Fox and you have Froggen, right, you can do a lot of things in that lineup, but one thing you are never doing is removing Froggen. Regardless of whether it fits the team better, whether he's underperforming, there's certain things you can't do. And so, as bizarre as it sounds, Koreans absolutely are willing to throw in random rookies for this exact reason, because they think it will make the team work, at least today, better than it was yesterday. Like, that doesn't really exist to the same degree in the West, right?
No, and I think that the Samsung example Kelsey brought up and how they have their own identity is like a really big example of it, because I feel like Samsung's identity is predicated on that they've spent so much time together that they are actually able to cover their flaws strategically. They are the absolute experts on themselves.
Yes.
They have figured themselves out like no other team has, and they are able to play to their flaws so well that they are actually able to do specific strategies versus other teams, and know how that's going to marry into their base play style, which is how they get away with having, not the best mid laner in the world, which is what SKT seem to think they need to keep on over like everything, which yeah, I mean, you brought up a really good point about Easyhoon. Like, it's actually kind of odd if they did just tunnel and we have to keep Faker this much when they had so much success with Easyhoon in what was arguably SKT's best world championship at the time, though. Like, they never had a record like that again, did they?
I mean, there are a lot of factors coming into play, which is that, like, the Korean region had to rebuild a lot of talent and a lot of stuff, and there really didn't have a lot of competition domestically, and arguably, like, the other two Korean teams weren't, like, as high on the level, and all of the talent that was in Korea that made it super successful just completely was a non-factor because they all went to China and all the Chinese teams sucked. So, I think that there are there's a lot of context to make that statement, but yes, it was definitely their most successful year. But Easyhoon also appeared in that World Championship as considerably less than they did in the spring season, which was where SKT struggled a lot more than they did in summer against like this very weak pool. So would they have? Koma has to be wondering, like, a ton of the talent from 2014 when SKT struggled the most in their history, didn't even make Worlds, like, since the Faker era. If all that talent is coming back, like, do we really have to dig in our heels and keep Faker? Like, we might have to this time, because then we might not be as successful. So I think that it's worth noting that kind of context as well when you bring that example up.
It's also, if you see what Faker is bringing behind the scenes all the time, and I don't know what that is, but if you see what players like this are taking behind the scenes all the time, you're also thinking, dear God, I give this guy up. I'm going to be against this guy. What could some other team do with him? That's always going to be in the back of your mind when you make these types of decisions, and they turn out to be like I think H2k dodged a goddamn bullet that they weren't against Forgiven the very next season. Like, that would have been the immediate thought, and that was the immediate thought that I had around the time. Okay. Some other team gets it right around this star player. Yes. Some other team gets it right. That's a terrifying thought for you if you're genuinely invested in winning. So you will find teams tunneling, thinking that this will give them the best shot because of that factor as well. It's not just about how well it will work within their team.
Sure. So, okay, then if we're going to use another specific example, then an example to me of a recruitment or just using a player where I never understood it really was, like, I know it became a meme. Like, I don't think people were always serious when they were implying Svenskeren was shit in TSM for the last, 6 months or 9 months. But I definitely think it was a consensus that people definitely thought he wasn't a good jungler anymore, and that, he couldn't do any more than he was doing. But I never understood that, because every time I've seen him in a team where he looked like he had a lot more to say in what he did, he always looked good to, at times, very good. So is it like, if even the biggest teams are making pickups like that, what does that tell you about the way they're recruiting?
And with TSM, I think that you can go back through their history and look at the junglers they've had and the way that they've played with them. And I just think that this is a team that doesn't necessarily understand jungle that well. Whereas like you look at EDG, and I feel like EDG is a team that doesn't really understand top lane that well, right? Like there are flaws in all of these systems that we've been bringing up, and some teams have them more so around specific roles and teaching and coaching specific roles. So I would say with TSM, they definitely have a jungle problem. But I also think that some of Svenskeren flaws ended up being progressively more relevant as strategy developed, because everyone talks about like Peanut as the battle ward, but I feel like Svenskeren was like the battle ward of season 4 or whatever, where he did the blind invades and people were hyping the strategy up then, and you see the flaws of that coming out more and more, both in the context of SKT and I think in the context of TSM, where now we just look at these players and it's like, why are you blind invading against pressure? Like, so I think that point is also relevant.
Well, that's also a good piece of context, is that if you're going to recruit someone like Svenskeren, don't just look at him as a player and go, what a good player. Go, what team did he come from? Because think about those different SK lineups. So the SK lineup before they had Forgiven was actually a lineup that didn't have like the maddest amount of skill, but it had like a lot of players who played together very well. They played a decent macro-orientated style. They had N-rated in their team. Then you look at the one with Forgiven. Obviously, then they had Forgiven to work around as well, so you have another dynamic on the map, you know? Like, it's not like he just existed in a vacuum and you just pick him up and go, right, well, who could know how he'll do in our team? You know, what I don't get, essentially, is, Veteran, why do people recruit players who... basically, you don't have any clue that they'd work in your system. Like, they might have worked in a completely different system, but you just think, oh, they're good, though. They're good players, so surely that'll work. Like, doesn't part of this also come down to the notion, which, listen, I don't know if you subscribe to this or not, so you tell me, but the notion that coaches teach players to play League of Legends. By my logic, right, I realize the game does change. The league's a bit different to other esports games. You have to kind of get a read on the meta and what you're doing in these aspects, right? But with that said, to me, a best, unless you're a rookie team, like a low-level team building up young talents, a top-level team should just be getting the players to play together. That's it. You're not teaching that player much about his role.
You mean, okay, so you're drawing a distinction between, like, teaching the player how to play, like, say, Gragas specifically, and teaching the player what his role needs to be at this specific point in time with the rest of the team, right?
Like, what is the point in getting this star player if he doesn't play in the style of what our system would suggest, but thinking to ourselves, oh, it doesn't matter, we've got a coach, he'll teach him how to play that style.
Sure. So the specific example of Svenskeren, they completely and utterly redid that roster, right? At the time. When they initially brought him up. So I think that there was a way that you could have rationalized that Svenskeren would have fit really well with this team. Because at the time, the reason that SK was like super popular, was super successful in the spring split of Season 4 initially, before the whole playoff thing, was because...
Season 5, but yes.
Spring, yeah.
Yes.
No. Jesses, they had Jesses in season 4.
Season
you mean
4.
Season 4 then?
Yeah,
right? So,
they were super successful with Jesses in the mid lane
they
in
won the
Season 4.
split.
Yeah, well, the reason that they were super successful back then is because they were prioritizing pushing champions before other people were, and then eventually people realized, wait a minute, it's not just that Jesses can only play like Ziggs, Ahri, and Orianna, and then that's it. These champions are actually really good in the current meta right now, and then you have Froggen doing like 500 farm on Ziggs and stuff, and then suddenly it was kind of over. But Svenskeren really shined when he had pushing lanes. And remember, like Freddy's champ pool was stuff like back when Mundo was basically a bully, and when Swain has always been really oppressive, but Swain was really good at being oppressive back then. And bot lane, if they could give N-rated something with a shit ton of threat like Leona, or just give him Lulu every goddamn game, they would, and you have a pushing lane bot as well. If Svenskeren had all these pushing lanes, he did really well. And then in Season 5, when it transitioned into the Fox Forgiven one, you had like 3 winning lanes, like straight up immediately, Season 5 spring. And then Svenskeren shined again, and then Svenskeren kind of understood how the top part of his map functioned, and the bottom part of his map was still very reliant on N-rated. There you go. I don't know why I forgot his name for a second there. Getting like these types of champions that you could pressure his lane properly with, again, when they had to remove Forgiven and get Candy Panda in. And so Sumscone was still able to carry like a lot of early games, but let's face it, they were never actually quite winning at that point anyway. Though I do remember a really specific game versus H2k where he basically like put the entire team on his back and carried them right up to the door of their Nexus, and they still lost. But like if SK were always against like another like low tier jungler, that was always enough for Sumscone to be able to take them at least almost all the way, if not all the way sometimes. So what TSM did was TSM perceived that they had the super team. They had Bjergsen, they had Doublelift, they had Yellowstar, they had Hornser. We have 3 winning lanes. We have a jungler that we know does really well, and we have 3 winning lanes. So that's why they did that. What they didn't realize was that they also had a series of superstar players who were actually winning their lanes for different reasons. So the reasons that SK were winning was because you had Forgiven, you had Fox. I can tell you straight up, neither of these guys say anything in game whatsoever. They are just that good in lane because they are actually mechanically skilled at the game itself. Before that, you had a team that was struggling to find its identity but in season 4, but had like the meta down. They were able to get all pushing lanes. They actually understood the necessity for this at the time. With TSM, you had a series of players who were always shoving in their lane really hard and seemingly doing really well in lane because they were actually the focal point for their team and they were directing it as such. And the big collapse in TSM was that you had all of these voices. You can even hear it in like the mic check thing that they did. Like it's just everyone's just calamiting over each other, and it's just so weird and so strange, and you're never going to get anything out of that. And that's where it all went wrong there. So then they went like back to the drawing board. They brought in like a Biofrost, and then they brought in Path to do like all of the coaching this time. And then you have, because obviously the last coaching stuff didn't work so well, and then you have Reginald coming back in and being like, all right, so this is how we're going to do all of this stuff. And he's doing it in like the very season 2 fashion that I believe you like briefly covered in like the last episode, which is not the style that Reginald thought he was getting when he recruited everybody and recruited a whole new coaching staff. He thought he could remove himself from this situation. Now he put himself back in, and the style that he promotes is not actually this free winning lanes, Svenskeren do your thing style that Svenskeren shines so well in. So that, like, I have to give this whole big explanation because there's never going to be one reason why, why people recruit some sort of superstar player but can't make them work. But with TSM, it's actually very easy to trace why it didn't work and why Svenskeren continues not to be able to work. He's now not in the environment that he should be in, where he was traditionally doing really well. And as Kelsey says, the people that are now around him and are directing the players of how to play the game are very binary in a way that does not suit Svenskeren at all. It's actually quite ancient, and they don't really just understand the jungle well properly. So they haven't been able to adapt to it.
Also, when I say that they don't understand like jungle that well, or jungle doesn't work that well for them, and you have like a really long consistent thread going all the way back to Thorin and to an extent even before that, you get to a point where if you don't understand jungle, you're not necessarily understanding like more than the basics of why we're recruiting jungle X. So if you're thinking about TSM, what is TSM going to prioritize even in Reginald's system? Winning mid lane. So even with just the core concept of a winning mid lane, Svenskeren could theoretically be a good jungler, right? Because if mid's always going to push up, then Svenskeren's going to do this. However, Svenskeren's style relies on a lot more of like baiting type strategies, and then like having people able to collapse from both sides in different lanes, and a lot more coordination in this sense that I don't think that as TSM set up in a way that is adaptable and applicable in as many situations that they're going to end up in. Also, there's just like not a lot of connect in terms of like what is Svenskeren doing with the rest of the team. So I feel like maybe Svenskeren was never like coached properly and how to set up these types of comms, or there's something going on that's wrong with TSM and understanding like situational play. And I think jungle is like insanely situational as a role, so I wouldn't even necessarily say Svenskeren could never fit that team, or that Svenskeren just like fundamentally stylistically doesn't fit that team.
I don't think Svenskeren's bad by any means. It's just definitely down to this team doesn't know how to adapt. Not how to adapt, but they don't necessarily know how to teach him to play in this type of style.
Okay.
So yeah.
Because here's the thing, okay, I'll give you another example, actually, funnily enough, from this TSM team, since you reminded me of it, which is when they recruited Yellowstar. Because this is another move, right? Where on paper, if you came to me, imagine I was for some bizarre, in some alternate universe, I'm the consultant for Reginald for his League of Legends team. And in the off-season, he comes to me and tells me, I'm putting all these players together, right? Pretty much every other player, I would say, yeah, I can see the logic behind it. Okay, maybe that'll work. Okay, good player. But the reason why I would have told him, oh, definitely don't get Yellow Star, is because two factors. One, yes, Yellow Star can be a great captain, a great leader, etc. But if you look at when he actually did that, was when he had the most receptive team you could possibly get in his position. You had rookies and you had players who actually will bow to your experience and assume you know what the fuck you're talking about. That's not going to work with Doublelift Bjergsen. It's, players who have very strong, defined ways of playing the game. Secondly, even beyond the whole captain part, let's say Yellow Star somehow had, talked them all into it, got them to buy into the philosophy. Why are you putting him with Doublelift? Someone who his entire career wants to smash Delane. That is the wrong support player to ever recruit to play with someone like that. Then, as a third element, which I won't blame someone like Reginald, you can't know this, but actually, Yellow Star's a reasonably sort of soft-spoken guy. He's not like a very dominant personality. So he's also not going to battle back when Doublelift doesn't like the way he's playing. He's just going to crumble as a person. So I would never say I could have predicted all the way it would go, that split, but these are warning signs that you should be able to figure some of these out coming in. Because as I say, as a layman, I could kind of pick up on some of these aspects. But bizarrely, a top team and all can just ignore all these and just think, it's Yellow Star, he just came top 4. Well, it seems like they almost went with quite a simplistic logic. Or, by the way, maybe I'll throw in the caveat, perhaps Doublelift naively actually requested him. That could also be some stupid logic of Doublelift himself. Guess what? I could believe Doublelift doesn't know what sort of teammate he wants and player,
Sure, and this is obvious to people like you and me because we've been in esports since long before League of Legends was even a thing anyway. It's not obvious to all of these owners and stuff are making decisions because for a lot of the ones that were, for example, TSM and CLG, League of Legends was basically the introduction to esports in the first place anyway. Yeah. So they haven't had enough experience and seen other teams rise and fall and stuff like this. And then now, and the reason why I am not scared at all of franchising, even if they were to fill every single impulse that they have with Europeans, all over as Europeans, they're all in charge now of people who read about esports in the newspaper last year when Worlds was going on. That's their first introduction. They're going to make so many more mistakes in all of this, and a lot of them think that they know what should be happening because all these young kids, they don't really know how sports goes. I do, and there's so many of them. You just flooded half the league with orgs that are run from the top down by people who don't know what they're doing for sure, but they have the money to go all in. People will keep making these mistakes like that, and it's just going to happen more in NA now. I think franchising is going to be really good for Europe.
I think also obviously that's a tangent that we'll get back to, but just on the Yellow Star point, I think a lot of people forget that TSM had an uptick even before Yellow Star was replaced, and they ended up coming in second in playoffs that spring with Yellow Star on the roster. So I think a very big part of that was just, in general, a lack of a unifying voice, which they slowly came to anyway. And maybe by the end of that, there was too much bad blood in the roster to have made Yellow Star work at that point. But maybe he would have theoretically worked if they had a better idea of what they were doing and what their centralized voice was going to be going in. And he ended up just not living up to this idea that maybe the other players had in their head of a very commanding, shot caller type player.
I can tell they literally thought they'd recruited High to play support position. Yeah. Ironically, he actually did end up doing that. But in this time, they thought they'd solved all their problems in one. That's why I've actually never blamed Reginald directly for that one thing, even though at the time we still had our feud. I've never said it was a stupid recruitment because a lot of these aspects are quite nuanced. From the outside, it looked like he actually. I agree with you, Veteran. I really think he did try to recruit what he thought was the best roster, and therefore wouldn't have all the old problems of the past years, and that he could step away. Someone could coach the team. Remember, he tried to get an outside coach to be a real coach and have path as strategic coach. A lot of this stuff, at least his intentions were good. Actually, I think actually it fit with a lot of what we're saying. It just didn't work out as well.
Yeah.
On the obviously the big franchising point, I think I agree to an extent in terms of so far what I've heard is that the mistakes that I feel NA was in a really in a much better point than they were with the during the NRG period, in terms of understanding like the balance between branding and like importing and setting up a good team ethic and like what is too much and are we overloading and all of this. But then you're getting to franchising, which is introducing, first of all, a whole new second system of academy teams, which opens the door for a team like Liquid to literally sign half of the region. And then
that's
you have
that's the fear right there. Oh my god, what if I'm against this guy? I don't have to be. I'm Steve.
Okay. Yeah, it's like the signing half of the region, and then you have to figure out how to set up like that secondary system and how to scout the players and what's working there. And then people have literally, like the Team Liquid thing came out with a setup for how they're doing their hierarchy. Like they're literally going to say we're employing scouts who are going to be underneath our head analysts in the hierarchy of like who reports to who, and all of this. It's like they've had this thing envisioned without necessarily knowing whether or not it'll work. So this idea that franchising is going to make everything bigger, and you have to figure out a whole lot of other stuff that isn't, as we mentioned before, organic. And then on top of that, you have a bunch of new orgs that aren't necessarily going to have learned from the previous mistakes of the other orgs, and they will make some of the very basic mistakes, like Korean is always better, or anything like this, that people I felt actually have learned by the end of last year to an extent.
Yeah, but they'll have invested so much money in it that they're not just going to be able to pull the plug on that and do an entirely new system. They will spend more years after they realize this year that whatever imaginary system they had in their head was actually not how esports should be, and that they don't have clairvoyance in this regard. They're going to spend years just trying to patch that and trying to get a return on their investment in that regard, which is part of the argument for actually just removing relegations in the first place, that firstly they wouldn't do that, but people aren't. It's going to be much cheaper to just kind of patch a system that isn't working right now until it is some semblance of working than it is going to be to just flood more money in just because, hey, we can't get relegated. These people still need to make money.
Okay, a question I have, right, because this is a scenario where I don't feel like there's a perfect solution regardless in any region, is what do you do in terms of recruiting players when, as I said, the future of what the meta will be, or what type of, and I don't mean champion composition, I mean like what type of player composition will end up being the strongest, you know, like do I want my star to be a top laner or the jungle, whatever. What would you say to recruiting in that respect? Because to some degree, isn't everyone kind of gambling a little bit there?
So like how do you start basically when it comes to recruiting?
Like, yeah, can that even factor into when you're doing the recruitment? Like
for me, I first would look at players that aren't just good, but players that I know that I work well with. Like I've now been in the scene for years. I have players in mind that I know I want to work with for at least a large amount of my career, if not my entire career, and I will prioritize those people first. They will be players who are good anyway. It's not like I'm just like grabbing my friends in because I'm very single-minded and wanting to win anyway. And then that gives me a baseline for how my team is going to optimally play, and then I'll tailor the rest of the recruitments towards that. You know, so that's typically my starting point. If you're coming in as a whole new org like franchising has done, and you just have 5 free slots, feel like that then ends up depending on the staff that you put in. And if it's just entirely new staff, yeah, that actually gets quite difficult from a point. So you're going to have to pray that your coach, who somehow doesn't have any experience in this hypothetical, but good God, have I actually just seen that happen in one of the franchising teams anyway, has a very specific idea for the best way to play the game in mind that isn't a meta-specific way, and knows how to find players, knows the type of characteristics he's looking for in players to start building that roster, or at least has an idea in his head of what that roster would look like. But it's very difficult once you just give these people a blank slate. Yeah, then you're basically banking that they have coaches of experience that can tell you how this should go.
I think to an extent you can start with, okay, the role that I understand the best is this. So I would want like a player who's good at this type of thing, and I can scout this type of player first. Now I need to think of like, and the nuances, and I can understand the nuances of that player. So you're not necessarily building around that player, but you're just like starting from a point where you really understand this, and this is going to work. And then you're going to say like these players will complement this player. I know that these players will work around. So you have to do a lot of research in that sense, but you can do that. You can also do the opposite and say, I don't understand this role very well. I need a player who's just going to be able to like learn this, and I can work with them, and I can maybe learn something from him, and then I can build in like the rest, and I can actually be less strict about the types of players I want in, say, mid, because I understand mid really well, and I'll be able to like help mid fill in gaps where like he doesn't understand how to interact with this role as well. And so like I think you can do both of those types of things and work from there just based on your understanding, like as a staff member is another approach that you can take. If you have a system in mind, like, again, people are afraid of the word system because of how much the meta changes, but we've already addressed like the success of playing towards a system that rosters have had. But if you have a system in mind that you know that has wiggle room, and it's like, okay, if the meta suddenly becomes super jungle centric, we can make this adjustment and everything like this, then you have that in mind when you're doing your recruitment, then I think it can still work very well.
Yes, I actually like that thought a lot. In terms of if you are a coach that literally just has a blank slate right now, you look to your own strengths and flaws as the first member of that team and you build it that way. But if you're an owner that's just looking to like straight up build a team before you even get a coach, and you've already started wrong, and you're probably going to fail because the coach is going to be an integral part of that team and he has to work well with them as well. That's why you have seen teams that just suddenly skyrocket, not because they replaced their coach, because they just removed them entirely. The whole thing has to be cohesive.
Another aspect that's hard is when you you have to kind of divide the two LCS up. So especially now in the franchising era, there are going to be NA teams that aren't good but have the money where they could still have a lot of options as to where they go with the players they recruit in the future. Like, so for example, in theory, the ceiling, if you got a good coaching staff, could be higher because you could be the 9th best team, but you could actually recruit the players you need to if you give this coach control and he's a good enough coach, and he could build out the right squad. Whereas, for example, in Europe, when you told me the thing before, I suspect that until they radically fix the economics of the EU LCS, it will always be, as you said, veteran, which is unfortunately, because part of why you can even have your superstar players in Europe is this guy's decided, I want to get to Worlds and I think Europe's my best chance. He's going to have a lot more sway over who he plays with, as opposed to his coach being able to say, no, trust me, this guy who you don't really know that well will fit the team and I can make him work. You know, there's no real way in Europe to get around it at the moment, right? I
mean, there it is if you have the respect of your players and if you know how to convince them to trust you in that regard. So that is definitely down to the coach, and why maybe the coach should just be the base of the whole thing. But there aren't enough good coaches that I could like just say straight up it should always be this way. It also depends on who the owner trusts more. Maybe the owner has their own opinion, and it will just depend on whether the coach or the player is tending towards that opinion itself. Depends how much control they want in that regard. There's all sorts of factors at play here. But yeah, the only way that you can get around that as a coach is to just have been good enough to get the respect of your players.
I think if you're a brand new org and you're coming into this space and you don't necessarily know it, you should expect for your first split to almost like, this is the power franchising gives you, is you should expect for your first split to be like almost an abject disaster. Because you literally don't know what you're doing. Maybe you've tried really hard to get feedback from people who know what they're doing. Maybe you really thought you hired people who knew a lot, and it turns out they don't, right? And you just were going about this from a perfectly bad angle. And then after that, you should be able to be willing to apply what you think you learned or what you think your staff learned, and trust that like this makes sense. And then after that, you should be able, so you should almost just like at this point trust that your players are the most knowledgeable centerpieces. And of course, the players are going to have like a great deal of bias at a point. Right away, and there are all sorts of flaws with giving them too much power, but they'll be able to probably teach the most from that perspective of anyone else you hire, unless you do get like a coach that everyone knows is really good and really experienced, which doesn't necessarily exist in the West. But you start from the players and you learn a lot from that, and you expect the first split to be a failure. You then get to a point where your knowledge and your staff's knowledge is good enough to start pushing back, and you can develop a relationship. So you should focus like first split, first year on developing a relationship with players. And if it gets to a point where like they have too much power, you may have to like end up at a point where you're either cutting some players loose and saying that they're no longer a good fit here, and we learned a lot from them, giving them good recommendations. Like, you don't necessarily want to play against them, but then, or maybe you get a substitute, you leave that player on the bench and say, we need to have this working relationship go both ways. I know it really sucks because we relied on you a lot, but it's just like, it's really hard to not give players too much power, and then it becomes from the opening as like a brand new org, and then from that point it becomes about like, how do we pull it back and how do we make this more of a working relationship and something that we've developed and grown. And I think that that's really hard. Like, we've seen it so many times where staff members had to learn from players, and then suddenly there's no respect given to players because they don't see the development happening. So I don't know, like it's a really interesting question, but I do think at a certain point you may have to start from players if you don't know what you're doing. So.
Sure. Because I mean, part of the problem I see with this whole aspect, like at the moment, there is no solution that anyone's found as to how to get around having a coach that's both good, but then has the respect of the players, but then the org also trusts him. Like, you come in from so many directions at once. Yeah. The funny thing is, though, the only people I think who could have done it and who actually haven't done as good a job with it is the only way I can think logic. Because here's the thing, okay, I'll put forward the premise as to why I think generally players don't actually respect any of these people. Is here's the test example. The sheer number of really, really good European League of Legends players who had offers for much more than they'll ever make per year back in Europe, who never took those offers because they weren't to, TSM. Since they knew they were to like bottom half or middle table LCS squads, the whole reason they turned them down was, in their mind, they thought to themselves, okay, yes, money's cool, it would be nice to have money, but I can't trust that these guys know what they're doing and will put the right players around me. And so barring a few very rare examples, nearly all of these players that I'm talking about stayed in Europe and were like, I'll just stay here where at least I have some sway over who I play with and the little clique we have. And then hopefully, if we're good, we get players into our team. So the only way I could see you short-circuiting that is if you had an org that, right, yes, the coach, we can't yet have the authority because there's just not that many of them who have that kind of quality and who have the established rep. But there are orgs, so we know TSM, Fnatic, these are orgs that in theory have, because they've won so much, at least have the initial appeal where you could probably get players on board with it. The problem is those orgs themselves then haven't always done the best job of empowering that coach. I mean, they haven't always even recruited the best coaches themselves. And then that's the bizarre thing. I think the orgs don't even trust the coaches. Like, it blows my mind that a team like TSM, forget the players they've had and the system, etc. They haven't even done that good a job recruiting coaches. Like, if you're out there with this sort of, like, they don't literally have a blank check anymore because there's so many VC orgs, but they still have a massive pull on who comes to their org. Why aren't they out there trying to sign the Prollies of the world, the Zix of the world, the people who actually have like the legit behind the scenes acknowledgement as like, these are very good coaches, not just the coach of the split or, this guy who has a makeshift team for us that sort of works, Why do you think the orgs never sort of build their end of the equation and then hopefully the players can meet them halfway eventually?
I mean, orgs do try, they just end up disappointed a lot. When it comes to Prolly, I think 100 Thieves just ended up winning that. When it comes
But I mean, the idea that it took until now kind of blows my mind, because think about all the radically different rosters the guy's had now, and he's constantly made it work. And I realise, by the way, there's a lot of idiot fans watching it. I'm like, haha, idiot, he always loses in game 5 and in the semis. Like, yeah, he doesn't play the game as well, mate. Like, all he does is tell the people, I'll play the game. And as we've already pointed out, doesn't always have direct say over who joins the roster, except obviously he's to blame for that Korean bot lane. But that's just a side tangent, just a shot across the bow there,
I mean, when it comes to Prolly specifically, I'm pretty sure he has had offers, but he also had a long contract with H2k. So I think it's just a combination of those two things. Okay. And then I don't know who else you would think of that all of these teams should be going for. There just aren't enough people. God knows they try. So
you have to invest in someone, I think, who is willing to always find a way to be useful from the get-go, because that's like a basic way to sort of gain some respect, is just like to make sure you're pulling more hours or to put in the work to actually get to a certain ideal that you have of where you should be. And then you have to invest in these types of people. Obviously, you don't want idiots either, but like you have to invest in these types of people, and then like hope that that very basic respect carries over to when they finally get to the point where they're able to have more of a command or a better, more concrete idea of what they're doing. They've learned a great deal from being in this position, because you're just right now with the way that coaching and management and everything else works is you're going to have so much on the job learning that it's ridiculous, because we're just not there yet.
See, the irony is that I could imagine some top Koreans actually describing Western coaches as useful idiots, to quote the old Soviet term, because, you know, a lot of these Western coaches actually think they're doing the right thing, but are helping the teams not succeed.
I mean, I think the more interesting question here is then, how on earth do orgs justify to themselves to empower these coaches long enough for them to actually gain the experience that they need to gain a good relationship with players and become good coaches? The thing, right? That's like the really interesting part.
I agree. This is a near impossible sell. Like, I would only personally, if I personally tried to make this my quest, right, to get an org to empower a coach to the level we're hoping that they can, so they can fully, I could probably do it, right? But first of all, I'd have to literally have an org owner who's known me a long time and really like respects like the concept. I'd have to sell him on the whole concept, and I would even have to sell him on the aspect that it actually might not work with this guy, but once we implement this as our process, eventually when we put in other coaches, one day you'll have one where it will work, and therefore, even if it has to go bad at first, in a way, you know, that will be part of the healing cure. Because the problem is, I have to say, it's not like in Korea they just had all these wicked coaches. Like that's one area you notice I have always disagreed with Monty, which is the idea that, like, because they had coaches in StarCraft, somehow there's any crossover to that's why they have amazing coaches now in League, and that you can cite this sort of 10-year history. No, what the 10-year history is of a culture of how team houses work and Korean hierarchy of you don't like talk to the coach in certain respects. Like, these aspects are what helps. It's nothing to do with the game. So in this scenario, I think Korea went through a bunch of bad coaches until eventually they got the good. They essentially did what I'm saying here, but again, cheating, because that's how Korean companies work. What happened was, in Korea, if you work in a company, if your boss is shit, enjoy your life being hell, because he's going to be shit and he will have full control over you no matter what, and you will just be like living hell, basically. But that means that if you ever get an amazing boss, because he will be empowered above you, now he can do all the things you would like him to do and help you succeed. So in the same sense, I realize it's so hard to sell an org on this, but if you're Reginald, if you're the guys behind Fnatic, you have to do this whether the guy you currently have can do it or not, because one day the right person will, that's what will enable them to be amazing, right?
Does every team have a coach in Counter-Strike? This is going somewhere.
Not as much, but then again, the problem with Counter-Strike that it doesn't work as well is that in theory every team has a coach, but oftentimes they're not as impactful, because the actual in-game leader, which every team has like kind of a shot caller in Counter-Strike, that person tends to be more of the coach himself, you know.
I agree there. And where Monty is correct, I'll go into where he's wrong in the set, so really easy. But where Monty was correct there is that having all these coaches in StarCraft and already having a coach in esports being an established thing meant that when Koreans got into League of Legends in Season 2, bam, they all have people everywhere who just want to coach the team, you know? People already had it in their heads, I want to be a coach, stuff like this,
for example, for context, they didn't have to have the discussions that we had literally in the West for 2 years of, do you even need coaches? Which again is like a perfect example of what you were saying about like CLG and TSM, which is like, you guys, this isn't even a debate. You're like debating as to whether we should invent a wheel, and in the other side of the world, people have cars already, you know, like, that's like, that was stupid. So I agree, they were definitely ahead of the game because they didn't have to convince people that coaches were a thing.
The thing is, though, that as a result, when Riot were like, right, you have to have coaches now, Koreans already had people in for 3 years that they could recruit that already had all of the experience that the orgs had no issue empowering now that they had to. In the West, everything would be so much simpler if Riot just hadn't said you have to have a coach. They should have said you have to have an on-the-ground point of contact for us at the LCS studios, and that would be fine. Some of them may just be like managers, some of them may just be coaches, some of them may be a fusion of both. People would find their identity in that regard, and then eventually you'll have people that the players would trust, etc. Because right now, when you put in a guy and say this is the coach, the players have an expectation of what a coach is in their head. For the players themselves, that's not even necessarily the correct way that a coach should be, because a coach should be different for each team. But that is why...
When you asked the CSGO question...
Can I finish this?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
This is why it's difficult for an org to justify empowering the coach, because when the player comes up and says this guy is not a coach, even if they never necessarily had a good coach in their entire life or something and just have this idea in their head of what a good coach is, the org can't come back and say, no, this guy is a good coach. They don't know either. This whole question is only put into place because Riot forced every team to have a coach, gave it the title coach, and so every player is judging them on that basis. So you're never going to have a situation where these orgs are going to stick with the coach and the players just have to deal with it, and it's going to be easy for them to justify, because this is something that they have to have, and players just think if you're going to have it, do it right. And because it has this title, they can't just be what Kelsey says and just be useful in any way. They have to be useful in like a very, very specific way to satisfy a lot of players. It's really difficult to develop proper coaches by which you can start basing the rest of your team on, by which franchise orgs can come in and say, yes, if I have this coach who isn't Prolly, that I can build a team around him and actually be somewhat confident with that. That's just, I don't see how this is actually going to end up happening unless you have like people who are just like really driven to actually be a coach anyway and are willing to like go through all the process of that. But there aren't going to be like what you now need 20 of them, because you need 10 more of them for the academy team in North America, plus 10 in Europe, plus whatever they're going to end up doing with the national league scene. If you have to have coaches there as well, then good God, how many coaches have to be there, have to be constantly passed about between each other, and can never actually develop because they're going to be judged on this way. And it's a mandatory thing.
I think even if you're coming down really hard on Riot for creating this, but I feel like at least in NA, the idea that, oh, everyone has to have a coach, if Riot had just called them a point of contact, NA orgs would all decide, oh, we need a coach because every sports team and every Korean team has a coach, so we should all have a coach. So this idea would still exist, I think.
That's fine. It would exist, but the org would be doing that. The org doesn't necessarily have to do coach. So it's not like every single one of them would be coach regardless. And if a player said, this guy's not really working out for us, fine, remove the title of coach. This guy's not your coach now, right? He's still here, but he's just like your manager now, you know? Right. Or he's just the help, you know?
When you asked
you don't have that freedom. You don't have that freedom now. Because
I don't think you would have had that freedom regardless. I think orgs would have this idea and they would mimic it anyway, and I don't think that freedom would ever exist.
Right, but orgs don't have to do it, so orgs don't end up putting people who they also know aren't coaches in the coaching position just to fill up a spot. Sure. And then this guy has a split of experience suddenly, and now he's going to be chosen over like some other guys who are actually trying to be coaches but don't have a split of experience. Then it turns into a season, then it turns into 2 seasons. Then you have threads of when is this guy going to get a new team, ironically, every day on Reddit, because he's become a meme at this point.
So was the reason why you asked about CSGO having coaches?
Because they don't all have them. They don't have to.
And here's part of the reason why, though. So actually, I think this might tie into your point, actually, which is, okay, CSGO is a very drastically different game, right? Because of you have to, essentially, the coach has to make a lot of, in an ideal world, okay, in Counter-Strike, a coach used to be able to talk during the game the entire time. Yeah. And that actually got taken away a year ago.
In Call of Duty, too.
As a result of that, right, it meant that you couldn't have the coach be the sole like tactical presence. Now you had to have the in-game leader again. That was more important. Because at the moment, for example, there are a couple of teams that have very good coaches. Actually, there's a team, NIP, that just won a big LAN who were big underdogs. And part of why they won was they had a coach where literally every time, like you only get 4 timeouts in a game. And every time he would take one, you would instantly see like a change from his team and they would start to get back into a game that was kind of like slipping away a little, okay? So the point is, there definitely are people who should be coaches who are very good, but I can tell you there are teams in Counter-Strike which either their coach does next to nothing or wouldn't need a coach, because in a setting where there's not anyone appropriate or the players wouldn't buy into it, it actually would make more sense to have whoever the smartest player is basically define that team for now until you can get them to buy into getting the proper coach, you know. It would probably make those teams much worse if you said to them, okay, listen, player who actually can control the game pretty well and's got a good read, no matter what you do, it always has to go through the conduit of this guy above who you don't respect. That's going to be a immediate problem.
Yeah, and that structure was kind of like forced on League. And I also think that the personalities in CSGO are also vastly different from the personalities in League, where in League, because it was, the whole scene was artificially inflated away. It's not just like, oh, we had to have coaches and blah, 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 but also the audience level was raised significantly because Riot just dumped so much money and took over the leagues themselves, did everything they could to push everything. And whereas with CSGO, like, LANs kind of organically grew. Every other sport, they've kind of organically grown. And the players who are at the top are the people who took responsibility back in the day, are the people who really want this type of responsibility. Whereas in League, you do have a lot of players who want someone else to take that responsibility. And when you say we're getting a coach, they look to that. And a lot of these people just aren't ready to take that responsibility coach-wise. And as a result, they're going to get phased out because these players, they don't just want one. They in ways do need somebody who's able to take that responsibility now, because they've been thrust into a limelight that didn't exist in esports for so long. And this is, the League is like the first esport to go like this huge. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's easy to understand why, like, people, you wonder why in Europe, like, content isn't this way. Whereas like in CSGO, you had frag movies and stuff like this all the time. And that was how like the first players got popular there. We never had a time where we were figuring out what was going to be popular or not. You just have streams now, which is like on every single game, like the most easy translatable thing. There's still not really an identity for what like League player-based content should look like. That was never able to organically grow. So all these types of strong personalities that typically come along with that, are typically attracted by that sort of thing, don't really exist. And a lot of these guys are now on professional teams, and they need like that figurehead. And there was never a period where these figureheads were coming up before Riot said you have to have it. And now players see that they have it. It doesn't live up to their expectations. You're an org, what are you going to do? That's
why in China, to an extent, the teams that are successful have a kind of like leadership type player, just because the orgs themselves probably are, I would say the Chinese LPL culture is the worst at empowering coaches of any of the major regions, because if like the players themselves end up being like really good friends with, say, the billionaire organization owner, and then so if the player is like, I don't like this guy, then his word kind of goes in, because fundamentally in the original times when like LPL or the Chinese LoL scene was growing, this type of relationship with like the billionaire child of billionaire owners would buy teams of players to like hang out with all day, right? And they would be part of the stream community. And so this sort of relationship grew, and then players became like really, really prioritized. So if you wanted your team to succeed, you needed to have a player with a really strong personality, because you wouldn't really like necessarily invest a lot into your coach, or give him a lot of authority within the team. So it definitely, like, those types of things definitely carry over in terms of like what you're saying. That's another example of the types of players who take responsibility end up succeeding way more.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, that's also another area where, like, first of all, that definitely exists in American sports. It's just that those are the bad franchises, typically, the ones where, you know, the owner's like way too involved and like making personal friends with the star player. Like, those tend to be the ones where, as you can tell, if you let one or two people like just do things at their whim, it's probably not going to work out best for the organization. But also, you've got to look at the fact that this is another area where it's not that whether Korea does it better or worse, they do it differently. Like in Korea, as far as we can tell, it is this structure of your coaching staff that picks the players. Right? There's no equivalent in Korea of like, oh, why did they sign that player to KT? Oh, the owner of KT said that he must have a player like that. Like that doesn't exist. You know, why that still exists in the West. Like, that's one area where I don't actually think when I did that interview with Reginald that I actually got through to him on that one. I mean, then again, it was an interview, so I wasn't necessarily like battling him. You know, I'd obviously speak very differently if it was a discussion show. But I don't think he actually did fully agree with the concept of what we're outlining right now, Veteran, which is that the coach has to have more control in this respect, and he has to have some say over who the roster is and stuff. I think Reginald still deep down thinks he's going to decide the roster no matter who's the coach, even if he gets the best coach in the world.
I mean, I don't know how long I can like keep retreading that part, but like in TSM also works so well because Reginald is the coach, and TSM at this point is basically dependent on Reginald being the coach in that way. And TSM as a result is one of the only teams in the West that has this type of thing where they technically have a coach that is taking all of this responsibility. They technically have that like generational thing there.
I also want to point out that Veteran is a coach and Reginald is an owner. So obviously Reginald is going to want more power and Veteran is going to want more power, like in terms of how they say. But I understand, like fundamentally, you would you want what's best for your team and what's best for winning. Yes. And I just feel like Reginald hasn't necessarily, I don't know if this is true, but my theory would be is that Reginald hasn't necessarily met like the guy that he believes like matches his vision, or he believes like will do a better job in making this decision. So I think that if he meets this guy, then maybe he'll really understand that point, and he'll say, okay, it's best for the team if I give this guy this power. I think like Reginald would be able to do that, but I just don't think he's met that guy yet.
I mean, it's going to be difficult because there aren't enough staff members out there that would also be able to match Reginald in every aspect, because he is actually rather imposing. When you talk to him, he is the type of person who, if he thinks you're wrong, he has multiple avenues of which to prove you wrong, and he knows he's in control. So you're going up against a confident guy. So first you need to be confident. I've just outlined like half the coaches in the West that I can think of at the top of my head, like immediately right there. They need to be able to combat him on an experience level. You need to be able to combat him on a game knowledge level, and he needs to be impressed at both of those right now. And you need to win over his team members at the same time, because you're probably going to have to do this in front of them. So your game knowledge has to be fucking good at this point. Reginald has to have no choice but to accept that you're better than him. Otherwise, he is going to rightly remember all of the other times he met someone he thought was confident. And that's never worked out for him. I'm pretty sure that 2016 Worlds is like going to forever stay in his head when, by all rights, everyone thought that they had it perfect, you know, in terms of setup. Even down to coaching stuff. Like he's going to need to be absolutely sure, and whoever actually takes this from him needs to be bloody ready.
I kind of implied as much when I said the example of where I think I could personally, if it was my mission, if the only thing in life I cared about was get a coach in this position, I could do it. But essentially I'm cheating there because I'm doing what you're talking about here. It should actually be the coach who's able to sell the owner on this vision and get him to buy it. So half the problem, which has always been a problem in League, more so than actually a lot of other games I've covered, is some of the people who would be the best suited to be a coach strategically, almost the qualities which make them like that. Let's be real. They're bookish nerds. They're people who sit alone, will watch a million VODs and enjoy that and aren't super social people. Is it a surprise that these people don't have charisma to win you over and don't have natural confidence in what, by the way, are considerable qualities that they have that are very good, but just doesn't translate to their outer persona? You know, they don't have that element. And so in this respect, I think that's not even a fault of the orgs. I kind of agree. These guys can't sell themselves in the same. They don't have the same presence.
Sure. I mean, we are in an industry that began as a fringe industry founded by the outcasts of society at the time. It's just
like this is a problem that doesn't exist in the same way in sports, because they think of it, sports as a culture of jocks. It's the opposite world there. In fact, what's funny is in sports, you know, they've gone the opposite problem. In a lot of traditional sports, they take the alpha male superstar player and let him become a coach, find out it doesn't work, and they had to go the other way. And the most successful coaches more recently are the nerds, but they had to win over the opposite battle in their field, you know, whereas in esports, I feel like we need the confident guy. Like, listen, say what you will, I know there are a lot of people who are very critical of people like Yamato, Cannon, etc., and they don't think like his game knowledge is that good or analysis, but he kills the persona part. He's absolutely doing the presence element and doing a very good job with that and seemingly getting through to players in that respect. So you can see how that aspect would thrive if I think it was paired with the right person's mind, you know.
This is almost where like the just get a Korean coach meme almost has some weight because of the way that the LCK region has been held up at such a high regard and like players' minds and the minds of the narrative. You almost have to like prove less as a coach to get like this kind of power and this kind of authority and this kind of respect. So like this is the almost, especially in the Chinese context, it's like if you have a Korean coach coming over, this is almost someone that the owners can't just like throw out. They have to kind of acknowledge, even if it's not true, that they hired this guy because he's more experienced or has more knowledge or is better suited to lead the team. Then you get into a whole other subset of problems where like the Korean coach doesn't understand the players culturally, and there are conflicts that arise here where you're not able to be that successful. But at least initially, I think like the Korean coach meme has almost had cases where it might be more successful, and like some cases, like so Song comes in and he's like, the Korean coach meme, right? Or like everyone just gets 70%. I think there is short run truth to what he's saying, just because there might be a higher willingness of players to immediately assume that he comes from a place of authority. I think that in the long run, that peters out. But if you have a guy who has like any type, like I guess the moral of this here isn't just get a Korean coach, but make sure you have some place to start from, some kind of buy-in or some way to establish buy-in as an organization when you're recruiting a coach, like some way to get the players on board with who you're picking up. And you have to sort of almost be delicate in how you're introducing the coach to the players. And obviously it would work better if the coach like starts out building the roster. But if you have a situation where you have an existing team, you have to bring in a new coach, you have to be delicate with the way that you're introducing him. You have to almost like kind of hype him up in a sense, and say like, this guy is really good for this, and this reason, and then hit some sort of point of first impression out of the park to give him a little bit more leeway to not just get immediately dismissed. All
right, so disagreed entirely. Korean coaches, by and large, have been abject failures with literally 3 examples. One of them is Loco. One of them is Song, who is really definitely needs another split before we can say if he's being a success or not. And the other one is Reaped.
Did I say that Korean coaches have, by and large, been success stories? I said that it's been success as a first impression.
Let me finish this.
Mm-hmm.
Reaped, thus far, he's done good, but he hasn't done anything super special that say Six wouldn't have done in his position, though he is good. But the confidence that Korean coaches come in with, and when you hold them up to players in that regard as well, the players themselves do not change their behavior just because the Korean coach is coming in. The players themselves behave the exact same way, and then the Korean coaches generally crumble because Korean players do not behave the same way towards them that, say, European and North American players do. And then the confidence that they come in with actually becomes like much worse, and there's just so much more that crumbles at the time, and these people end up looking for like all types of weird alternate solutions to things that just don't work, and then eventually they've all been phased out. It just doesn't work, and I actually think that the confidence aspect that they come in with is actually a detriment to them, rather than like
I think you have to live
where
up
the Korean thing like might actually hold some merit in this regard. There's just too many instances where they've come in and it's being over after a week.
I think you have to live up to it, but I think there's a difference between like coming in with no faith whatsoever versus like, I think that was the point I was making, is not get a Korean. My point was come in with like some way to give them some initial buy-in to the system. Whereas I feel like there just isn't initial buy-in to like a lot of coaches overall. And maybe your initial buy-in is like, okay, this guy doesn't have authority. This guy is here to like research things you want him to research, but it has to be something. Otherwise, like he has nothing.
Like, here's the problem. I kind of agree with both. Like, here's the thing. I agree with the premise that, like, especially if it was a well-respected Korean coach, like the example of like Loco. Like Loco's not even really. He wasn't a coach to start off. He's Korean, but he spent enough time in America. He may as well be a 14-year-old Los Angeles girl. Like, he's in no sense really Korean to me, right? I think he's a faux Korean. So take
he's a faux
now. So, but. I will say this, like, if you could bring in, like, obviously an example would be like a Coma, or, I mean, unfortunately they're not as famous as some of the other ones, but let's say some of the other good coaches of history from, right, I do think they would at least initially get a little bit of a boost where people might like be like, okay, I'm open-minded, I'll listen to this guy, I haven't had good coaches in the past, maybe that would work. The problem is, though, I kind of agree with Veteran a bit, that I think it almost inevitably, if not in the short term, it would over time break down, partly because, first of all, the structure we're talking about set in place with the orgs needs to be set in place by the org. Like, they can't just set it going and hope it works. And then secondly, definitely the thing that you said about, like, the Korean players don't treat me this way, right? That's another reason why I never bought the idea that Korea had figured it out, because I've actually spoken to some of these Korean coaches, right? And people who know my persona know that I don't mind poking a bit of fun at people, talking a bit of shit, right? When I've done this to some of these coaches who, by the way, in the setting of LCK look like the most confident guy who knows exactly what he's doing, they would literally turn to other people and sort of be like, how can he say this to me? Like, tell him to stop.
Yeah.
Like, they actually, essentially, the example I'm giving is they knew that their authority came from the power structure. So what they were doing by telling the person who's with me who's Korean is, it's your job to tell him not to talk to me that way. Like, this guy didn't even have the confidence. This isn't just one example, by the way. They don't have some insane charisma themselves where they could be like, no, Thorin, I did it for this reason, They didn't even want to engage on that level. They were like, that's not the way this runs.
Yeah, the way that they deal with conflict itself is has been very questionable in a lot of examples that I've heard.
I've never even debated this. Like, if you've actually seen a lot of the work I've done, I actually think Korean coaching is the worst role to import. But the fundamental point I'm making is that you need buy-in. And I think that was a buy-in that people are looking for, and that's why Korean coaches became very attractive. Is because you could introduce them to players in that sense, especially in China. I think that's why you have by and large the majority of coaches are still Korean. Is because and this was also someone that the owners kind of had to acknowledge as an authority. But you need to be able to get to a point where I think that's a lesson to take from it. But I don't advocate at all importing coaches with a language barrier, because I think that's the worst role to import from. A lot is carried in subtleties. A lot of, we talked about how important confidence is, how important it is when you're talking to players and addressing them. Even if you have the best translator in the world, you're missing so much of that by having a language barrier with your coach for the primary majority of your players. So yeah, I'm not advocating, I obviously set up my point really, really poorly. If that's what you guys took from this, is I'm not advocating importing coaches. I'm saying that this is something that was interesting, is that the buy-in of being Korean almost kind of worked to a degree in this particular case. So I think that any kind of introduction or first impression that can be made from the coach to make them have some level of authority is really important.
I'll also say, by the way, to maybe help Kelsey explicate the point I think she was actually making, was that, remember, she said it in the context of the LPL. Right, you have to remember, before Korean coaches, some of those LPL teams were the lunatics ran the asylum. They were just players were all over the place, whatever the fuck they wanted, and played however they pleased. So as much as you can definitely critique LPL, I think the Korean coaches at the very least played an important sort of role in getting them to a middle ground where now they are developing, ironically, back into Chinese lineups, to have strategy and play the meta to some degree. So I think they did.
They're also going back into the similar results that they had before all of this stuff happened. They reached 2 world finals before they started mass importing like this, and then arguably Korean coaches were why, for example, the Chinese super team of OMG didn't work out so well. That was literally one of the huge reasons why.
That's one of the reasons. Yes. I don't think by and large,
I definitely don't think that they came in and that they actually helped expedite the situation or anything. I think China's just starting to realize that entire thing didn't work out so well, and are reverting to they're reverting to Chinese coaches and people who are actually being really successful for them.
Yeah, they are. Really for sure, they're introducing the concept of they really want, they don't want to import as many coaches now. They want to have people who fluently speak Mandarin Chinese in a lot of positions. A lot of teams are going that route based on, they call it the royal model or whatever. But they have, I think that Korean coaches introduced the concept of coaching almost to Chinese teams to an extent where it's not just some guy who orders pizza for you, or it's not just some guy that the boss can fire whenever he feels like it. So I think that is a larger point, is just the concept of someone having an ingrained authority.
Which is what we were talking about. So that ties into the concept, of how the structure of your org's going to work. So I agree, yeah.
Oh God, though, but
it's it's almost you teach things to children that are based on parables and really simple stories, and obviously you aren't going to assume that the idea of Santa Claus is developing giving and then all this sort of charitable, be kind to your neighbor, but you obviously at a certain point stop believing that there's a guy who can visit every house every night. Just the idea of a Korean coach as like this Korean model of a basic structure, and you stop like believing that they have ultimate authority and they know everything at a certain point, but you just believe in this concept of the structure, and you start to understand the concept of the structure, if that makes sense.
All right, this would have just been like literally my 1 point answer to Monty if Monty tried to bring up the StarCraft coach thing, because wasn't there like one of the best StarCraft coaches of all time was brought onto QG, I think? Right?
Oh, the guy
yeah, and he literally just ended up ordering pizza all the time or something stupid like this, no?
I mean, he was so this situation was a little weird. He ended up they brought him in not expecting him to like necessarily know the game, but they expected him to have some sort of authority. And then they had a Samsung coach to do like strategy and pick ban. So that was kind of how that was set up. I don't necessarily think this guy had like any sort of say in what happened. I don't necessarily think he really understood his own role. I don't think the team understood his role. So it was just like a really weird situation.
We need
in
more
general,
of these, like Monty says.
Based on my understanding. So I don't like. It's weird because you kind of want to absolve the guy and say it's not his fault, but at the same time, like he had no. I don't necessarily think he did anything effectively. I don't know. The entire team structure doesn't make any sense to me. I think QG was definitely one of the teams where they were like, we're going to do everything and we have a lot of investment and we're going to build infrastructure here, and here. We have this really cool color-coded system on our board, but then like all the investigation that came out, it's heavily assumed and implied that it just ended up with like Swift having control of everything anyway. So I don't know. It's just like a very bizarre situation. Obviously, I don't have like absolute knowledge of what happened, but based on what I've heard from people and based on like information that came out and like chat logs and everything else that was released, this was kind of the situation.
Okay.
StarCraft, fine. StarCraft.
Why not, right? Because here's the thing. Here's a question I would have then, okay? Because when I think about these topics all combined, like if I imagine I was Reginald, I'm the owner of TSM or an equivalent, big NA team where in theory it's a good destination, a lot of players would like to join. So the bizarre part about the mistakes that they've made is if I try to think how it would be best to build my org, I actually think coach should be the #1 priority in my entire org. Because it's actually the one area where, first of all, that person could be in my org for 10 years potentially. Probably not, but it's a potential at least. Not many players are going to last more than a year or two. Even star players, Secondly, once I have that all in place and I've built the structure and I've got the good coach, then as we've discussed, we can use our splits to recruit the right sorts of players and figure out, we can learn from our mistakes basically. And beyond that, I actually feel like the reason why people like TSM didn't notice any of these problems is what happened is they used their strength as a crutch. Like, they didn't ever have to have the best coach because they always had some of the best players and they could constantly re-up with more of the best players. And having some of the best players in a region where not that many good coaches exist and coaches don't have as big an impact probably lets you win and do very well. So you can see how they constantly ended up in this predicament. And as far as I can tell, the only real approach they tended to look at was the player approach to we've got to recruit a different player, we've got to do that. Whereas they never were addressing kind of the thing that could have boosted the entire scenario for my money.
Yeah, but again, who do you go for? And then when they see that there isn't anyone, they're like, let's just grab a Korean coach. Coaching is why it's so good over there, no? And then doesn't actually work out either. So what do? It's kind of like, it's a no-win situation. So I keep blaming Riot.
I think it's, again, you get to this point where you want to develop coaches. So you have to start out from a player perspective, and then the puzzle becomes more, how do you give authority back to the coach once you've developed him? It sounds like terrible, but it's almost like the only situation then is to just like kick all your existing players and start over with a new roster that this guy will have authority over. But there has to be a way around it, right? Like you have to be able to build a mutually beneficial relationship from the player person perspective. All this guy is like filling into his role and getting the necessary experience. It's just very awkward.
But this is where you would go for it's plan B, it could be plan A. It's not plan B, it's not plan A, it's the other way things go. Why I asked Thorin about CSGO, because the other solution is you get an in-game leader. You build your team around High. You build your team around like these strong shot callers. Yeah. Maybe Yellowstar becomes a really strong shot caller at some point, like everybody thinks he is, and you build it around him. Build it around Miffy. Yes. Build it around people that we know are really strong in-game leaders. You don't have that option. You don't have it because Riot set it this way.
I don't.
And there are too many players. There are too many players that believe it should be this way. There also aren't enough in-game leaders right now because there aren't enough personalities around that are into that sort of thing, because the league itself was artificially inflated to the level that we have right now. League itself is League of Legends is the LCS. You have to have 10 players. You think there are 10 in-game leaders like that in Challenger? No. Obviously not, but it has to be this way. It's not like a series of like LAN events where some teams have in-game leaders, some teams don't, and they've brought on like another player that just does strategy or whatever. Maybe one day that guy will turns out to become like the coach, you know? Like this stuff wasn't allowed to organically happen. CLG was so like good, well placed when all this came about. Because they had Zix, they had that guy who just like joined them around all of these lands as an analyst, and he's eventually become a coach, you know. But other teams didn't even have the chance to organically do this. Yeah, like the most successful ones were the ones that actually started doing this in the first place. Probably was in H2k before coaches had to be a thing.
I mean, I think obviously the most successful ones. You're basically also saying the most successful ones are the ones who are most experienced and who started before everyone else before it was a necessary
thing. They didn't start because they had to, they started because they wanted to. That's the motivation aspect of it. And we're not able to divide the good coaches from the good in-game leader teams because we haven't had this like organic progression of things occur. These people haven't stepped up because they wanted to step up. They've stepped up because they've had to, and it's just a job.
Let me ask you this. If you had, like, ideal scenario, you have a guy you know who could be a coach, and you have a situation where, like, do you think that a good coach will always add value to a team?
I mean, a good coach by definition has to be adding value to a team.
Yes. So do you think it's always worthwhile to get a good coach if you can?
Depends on if you need that to progress your team further.
I mean, if he's always going to add value, then obviously your team is going to progress.
Sure, but okay, so you say like a good coach. What if my good coach is also one of my players? So Miffy.
Okay, I mean,
that's my good coach. I already have a good coach. Do I need a good sixth person?
So do you think that
doesn't have to be the coach? We just Riot has said it has to be a coach. Do I want a good sixth person outside of the team? Yeah, I would want a good sixth person outside the team. Okay. Does that have to be the good coach? Not necessarily. Maybe I already have my good coach. He just happens to be one of the players as well.
I mean, I think that also the way we've defined coach can be changed. I don't necessarily think the word itself is like to blame, because I think there are different concepts. I think the narrative
want someone like this so much.
I mean, I think it's more the narrative around what a coach should be when coaches first started developing is more to blame than the word itself. Because I don't necessarily think the idea of coach had to come out straight out and just be like this guy with absolute authority, all this other stuff. Even in the context
that's why I get to the personality aspect of things.
Here's the problem.
Why I think I can be that way.
Right, wait a second. I think I can explain the difference in communication here. The problem is, I agree, Kelsey. If you sat down and you said, what does coach entail and what can a coach be in all these factors, you and I could absolutely come to an agreement of all these different aspects. But in a world, especially obviously veterans coming from Europe, where we're saying like star players have a lot of impact on the team and what happens, their paradigm for what a coach is set and it's hard to break. Like, for example, I know so many examples of people who are very intelligent at League of Legends who became coaches, and half the reason why they failed in teams was when they came in for the first 2 or 3 weeks, their team was like, oh, I'm loving this, and the star players were like, oh, this is great, you know, he's brought all the X, Y, and Z, and what would happen was the player thought that the coach was supposed to be the guru of League of Legends who knew everything about League of Legends. So after 3 weeks, when they've sort of figured out the few areas that guy is a specialist in and knows things about and learned a couple of tricks from him, when they then think for some bizarre reason, oh, he's all out of shit, like I know everything that he knows now, they would then all be like, oh, well, why are we even listening to this guy? He just tricked us. And I would always tell these players, you know that's not his job, right? His job is not to teach you little tricks about League of Legends you didn't know. Like, even if he knew nothing else but could just evaluate your performance and point out simple mistakes you were making, that would have value, obviously. And a lot of these players, I agree, Veteran to a degree, had a paradigm set where that wasn't enough. The coach had to be like fully above them in some weird, like godlike capacity.
This has only occurred because of the inorganic growth of the scene.
I don't think it's Riot's fault that happened. I just don't think it's Riot's fault. Like, my point that I'm arguing is that I don't think it's Riot's fault that players have unrealistic expectations of what a coach should be. And I think that the concept, a lot of organizations would have agreed that there should have been, like, NA would have, like, almost 99% sure NA would have forced the concept of the coach on, like, almost every single team because they have a lot of money, even if Riot didn't mandate it. So, like, NA for sure, I feel like that would have happened.
I know they wouldn't have.
I mean, you can
because
say
they haven't in other games. That's the thing. This is the only game. It's a problem because it's the only game where it
NA has like a ridiculous amount of like. And okay, so here's a counter to that. Not every other game has Korean competition. A ridiculous amount of the majority of Korean teams had coaches, and NA teams were looking to the OGN teams and saying like, oh, they all have coaches. We don't have coaches. We should force coaches on our team. And I think that that's like also a point that you bring up if you're looking for someone to blame for like the inorganic development of coaching.
Did this happen in StarCraft 2 with NA teams?
I mean, this is a much older.
Yeah, the problem with that is StarCraft 2. The problem with that is StarCraft 2 doesn't really work because it's an individual game, so like the team aspect only works.
But she's saying that all of the Korean teams had coaches, therefore NA teams figured they had to have them at some point.
I mean,
Did the NA teams react that way in StarCraft 2? The
kind of money injection in StarCraft 2 that there was.
Yeah, that's all due to artificial growth. I already brought up that all these people had an idea in their heads of what a thing should be, and it doesn't happen. But that's an Actually, yeah, that is absolutely right. Riot dumped as much money as they could into the esports aspect of it. They thought they became like the favorite of the people for a while because of that. As soon
as anyone caught like some idea, oh, this esport thing is cool, like some guy with money was going to come in and say, oh, yay, woo, let's invest in a bunch of different shit. And then
but they wouldn't have the power that Riot did to deny the normal LAN circuit. They wouldn't have that power.
Yeah, sure, I agree. But I don't necessarily think that we wouldn't have every single team without a coach if Riot hadn't built the LAN circuit as well. I'm just saying that, like, yeah, I agree. I think the concept of having, like, developing someone to help the team, of, like, forcing teams to develop someone to help the team, like, maybe they screwed up in calling it a coach. I don't necessarily think it was a screw up in calling it a coach. I think it was a screw up in framing what a coach should be, which was partly Riot's fault in how they did the narrative. It was partly, like, journalists' fault in how they did the narrative. It was partly, like, players, but it was, like, a big, perfect storm of things. But I don't think you can levy everything at the fact that Riot mandated someone called a coach be on your team. I think that there was like a lot of ways that this could have happened anyway. And I think that also like it's not the idea in and of itself is not necessarily a bad one, because there's no way you're not going to develop. Like, I think the thought process is that orgs aren't going to necessarily develop someone to help their team unless we require it, or unless it becomes a requirement. I think eventually teams would want to have something to do with their money anyway and would have done it regardless. But I just like artificial growth stuff obviously is problematic, but I don't think it's the coaching issue is all due to artificial growth.
This is LS and you're on Thorin's YouTube channel, so cut the Western shit.